The streets glow, but they do not warm. Gaslight shivers against bricks slick with frost, and the air tastes of coal smoke and damp cloth. Somewhere, a carol drifts thin and fragile, swallowed by the cough of the city. Windows shine with promise, yet behind the glass, fingers are numb, lungs burn, and hunger sits quietly at the table. This is Christmas in Victorian London, not a scene of comfort, but of endurance. If you're listening late, drawn in by lamplight and shadow, take a moment now to like and subscribe, and tell me where you're listening from tonight. These stories travel better when they're shared, passed hand to hand like borrowed warmth, and your presence keeps the fire burning as we move deeper into the past. Because the Christmas we're taught to remember, the ribbons, the feasts, the glowing hearths, was a luxury few could afford. For the rest of the city, December meant longer shifts, stricter workhouses, frozen rooms, and a performance of cheer demanded by custom and church alike. Charity came with conditions. Joy came with judgment. And beneath the songs and sermons, Victorian London counted its poor, its sick, and its dead. Tonight, we strip away the greeting cards and step into the ether-sweet cold beneath them. This is the Christmas history rarely shows you, the one lived in breath fog and empty bowls, in hope rationed by the hour. Stay with me, and let's walk into that winter together. December does not announce itself in Victorian London with bells or blessings. It arrives quietly, stealing the light first. By mid-afternoon, the sky has already begun to sink, turning the city the colour of old pewter. Shadows lengthen along the streets, and shopkeepers move more quickly now, hands stiff, breath visible. This is the hour when the gaslights begin to hiss awake, one by one, casting a thin, trembling glow that promises warmth but never quite delivers it. The lamps do not banish the dark, they merely rearrange it. Corners remain swallowed, alleyways retreat into blackness. Faces pass through the light and vanish again, half seen, anonymous. The glow reflects off damp cobblestone and frozen puddles, making the streets gleam like something polished for display. London looks prepared, London looks festive, and yet the cold presses harder with every step, finding its way through boots, through seams, through bone. Winter in this city is not gentle. It does not drift in with snow and silence. It grinds its way forward, carried on coal smoke and fog so thick it seems chewable. The air burns the throat. The lungs work harder. Each breath feels borrowed. Above it all hangs the smell: chimneys, refuse, unwashed wool, the faint sweetness of chemicals from factories still running late into the year. This is the perfume of December, long before any hint of spice or pine. As daylight dies early, time itself feels distorted. Workdays stretch longer, not shorter. Employers do not loosen their grip for Christmas. If anything, the pressure tightens. Orders must be filled, deliveries made, markets stocked for those who can afford to shop. The poor do not receive reprieve with the season, they receive scrutiny. Their hunger is suddenly visible, their need inconveniently public, and therefore judged. Windows begin to glow from within, some warmly, many weakly. Curtains are drawn not for privacy but for insulation. Thin fabric attempting to keep the cold at bay. In the wealthier districts, parlours are dressed for the season. Greenery is pinned into place. Candles are set carefully, ready for evenings of ritual and restraint. But even there, the chill remains. Coal is expensive, fires are measured, comfort is calculated. Elsewhere, there is no calculation at all, only absence. In crowded rooms where entire families sleep, frost creeps along the walls. Water left in bowls forms skin-thin ice by morning. Children wake coughing, their breath rattling in chests already strained by damp air and poor food. These homes do not glow, they flicker. A single flame, if any, fights a losing battle against the cold pressing inward from every surface. Outside, the city continues its performance. Shopfronts display seasonal goods meant for admiration as much as purchase. Posters speak of charity, of goodwill, of moral renewal. Churches prepare sermons heavy with instruction, lighter on mercy. Bells rehearse their authority over the streets, ringing out over neighborhoods where the sound brings no reassurance, only reminder. The gaslights, meanwhile, burn steadily, indifferent to what they illuminate. They shine on silk sleeves and bare wrists alike. They reveal red noses, cracked hands, and faces drawn tight against the cold. They witness everything and soften nothing. Beneath their glow, London moves forward, wrapped in custom and expectation, insisting that this is a time of joy. But joy here is seasonal theatre. What December truly delivers is exposure. It strips the city down to its essentials and shows who is sheltered and who is not. It reveals which lives are warmed by tradition and which are simply endured until spring. And as the gaslights come on earlier each day, the truth becomes harder to ignore. This is how Christmas begins in Victorian London. Not with celebration, but with darkness arriving ahead of schedule, and a city forced to pretend it does not feel the cold. The decorations arrive before relief ever does. London dresses itself for Christmas with a careful hand, as though fabric and foliage might persuade winter to behave. Shop windows bloom with garlands. Doorways sprout holly and ivy, their green sharp against brick blackened by smoke. Even the poorest streets acquire some token of the season, a ribbon tied too tightly, a sprig pinned where the wall has begun to crumble. The city understands appearances. It always has. But decoration is not nourishment. Wreaths do not fill stomachs. Paper angels do not warm rooms. The contrast is sharpest in December, when the promise of plenty hangs everywhere, visible and unreachable. Markets swell with produce meant for celebration, birds strung by the feet, puddings dense with suet, oranges stacked like treasure from warmer worlds. The smell alone is almost cruel. It drifts outward, carried on cold air, reaching those who will never cross the threshold to buy. For the working poor, Christmas food exists mostly as rumor, a story overheard, a description passed from mouth to mouth. Meat becomes an idea rather than an ingredient, sugar a luxury measured in pinches. Even bread, dependable and dull the rest of the year, grows precious as wages strain against rising winter prices. What little money comes in must be divided carefully, rent first, coal second, everything else last. Festivity does not enter the equation. Inside the homes of those who can afford it, tables are set with deliberate symbolism. Meals become demonstrations of order and gratitude. Grace is spoken, portions are generous. The ritual reinforces the belief that Christmas is a time of abundance, proof that the system works when followed correctly. Those outside this circle are rarely considered, except as objects of seasonal reflection, someone to be helped, perhaps, but not too much, and never without instruction. In poorer districts, preparation takes a different shape. Women stretch ingredients to their breaking point, inventing meals from scraps that would be unthinkable in other houses. Broth becomes thinner. Leftovers are reborn again and again until there is nothing left to transform. Children learn to eat slowly, not because they are taught, but because hunger teaches them first. Silence at the table becomes its own discipline. The city does not hide this imbalance. It simply reframes it. Charity announcements bloom alongside decorations, encouraging the fortunate to give, but always with restraint. Aid is offered in measured doses, carefully managed so as not to disrupt the moral order. Hunger, after all, is widely believed to be instructional. It teaches thrift, it teaches humility, it teaches obedience. To relieve it too fully would risk erasing the lesson. So, London drapes itself instead. The visual language of Christmas grows richer as actual nourishment grows scarce. Printed scenes of happy families circulate widely, passed hand to hand, pinned above mantels in rooms that do not resemble them at all. These images serve a purpose. They tell people what Christmas is supposed to look like, even if it never looks that way for them, especially if it never does. On the streets, the divide becomes impossible to ignore. Well-fed shoppers hurry past the thin and the shivering, packages tucked close, eyes fixed forward. Begging becomes more visible in December, not because need is new, but because the contrast sharpens. A child asking for coins beneath a decorated shopfront feels like an accusation, and accusations are uncomfortable. Many respond by looking away. Food, when it appears for the poor, often arrives wrapped in ceremony. A charitable dinner, a distribution of bread, a moment of sanctioned relief that allows the city to reassure itself. For a day or an hour, hunger is paused, then expected to resume quietly. Gratitude is required. Restraint is praised. The system remains intact. Christmas in Victorian London is thus less a feast than a display. The city eats with its eyes, consuming images of generosity and fullness, while vast numbers remain unfed. It is draped in symbols meant to suggest care, warmth, and shared joy, but beneath the greenery and the paper stars, the cupboards are still bare. The season moves forward anyway, decorated and confident, asking its hungriest residents to admire what they cannot taste, and to believe that this, somehow, counts as celebration. If Christmas had a scent in Victorian London, it was not sweetness. It was smoke. Coal smoke thick enough to cling to hair and cloth, to settle in the throat, to stain the lungs over years until breath itself became labored. Long before any hint of spice or baking reached the air, this was the city's perfume, sharp, bitter, unavoidable. It seeped into every street and every room, a constant reminder that warmth here was paid for in black dust and shortened lives. Coal was survival, it was also scarcity. As December tightened its grip, fuel became as precious as food, and far more visible in its absence. Chimneys that did not smoke marked households already rationing heat, choosing which hours deserved warmth and which would be endured. In many rooms, fires were lit only at dawn and dusk, the brief moments when cold felt most unbearable. The rest of the day was spent wrapped in layers, fingers stiff, breath shallow. The smell carried everywhere. It hung low over the city like a second sky, merging with fog until the two became inseparable. On some mornings, London woke submerged, buildings reduced to silhouettes, gaslights glowing like drowned stars. Sound travelled oddly in this air, footsteps muffled, voices swallowed. It was a city half erased, made smaller and more oppressive by the weight of its own atmosphere. Inside factories and workshops, coal burned relentlessly. Christmas did not slow production. Steam engines demanded constant feeding, and men and women labored beside furnaces that scorched the skin while leaving the rest of the body cold. The irony was bitter. Heat concentrated where it was least comforting, exhaustion where it was least avoidable. Clothing absorbed the smoke, carrying it home, embedding it into domestic life until there was no clean boundary between work and rest. In wealthier homes, the smell softened but never disappeared. Fires burned longer there, brighter, attended carefully. Coal was arranged neatly, grates polished, ashes removed promptly. The smoke was managed, civilized, transformed into something almost respectable. Even so, it lingered in curtains and carpets, a faint reminder that comfort depended on constant combustion. For the poor, coal smoke was not background, it was foreground. It filled cramped rooms where ventilation was poor and windows sealed against the cold. Children grew accustomed to coughing fits that worsened in winter, their chests rattling beneath thin blankets. Doctors named conditions they barely understood: bronchitis, consumption, weakness of the lungs. Treatment rarely extended beyond advice and prayer. The air itself was part of the illness, but no one suggested changing it. Meanwhile, the imagined sense of Christmas circulated freely in print and conversation. Oranges, nutmeg, warm bread. These aromas belonged mostly to stories and advertisements, descriptions designed to evoke comfort whether or not it was present. For many families, such smells were remembered rather than experienced, recalled from rare moments or distant childhoods. They existed in the mind far more than in the kitchen. The contrast was sharpest near markets and bakeries, where fleeting traces of sweetness escaped into the street. People slowed instinctively, breathing deeper, letting memory do the work that reality could not. Then the wind shifted, and the coal reclaimed the air, heavy and final. Whatever promise had lingered vanished just as quickly. This was the true sensory landscape of a Victorian Christmas. Smoke-stung eyes, soot-darkened snow, air that pressed down rather than lifted. Even churches carried it inside, incense unable to compete with the residue clinging to coats and boots. Prayers rose through coal-tainted breath, directed heavenward from a city that could barely see the sky. The season spoke of warmth and renewal, but the body knew better. It knew the burn in the lungs, the grit between teeth, the way cold crept back the moment the fire died. In Victorian London, Christmas did not smell like celebration. It smelled like fuel burned, rationed, and inhaled, and it marked every breath as part of the cost of surviving winter. The bells begin before dawn, their sound spreading slowly through the cold, like a bruise blooming beneath the skin. They do not rush. They do not hurry to comfort. Each toll is measured, deliberate, heavy with instruction. In December, the bells ring more often and for longer. Advent, Christmas Eve, Christmas morning. The city is reminded again and again that this season belongs to God, to gratitude, to reflection. The bells do not ask whether anyone is listening with a full stomach. For many households, Christmas morning arrives unchanged from the day before. Bowls sit where they always do, clean but empty, waiting more out of habit than hope. The bells pass overhead regardless, vibrating windows that struggle to keep the cold out. Mothers pause in their work when they hear them, not because they expect miracles, but because the sound demands acknowledgement. It is difficult to ignore authority when it rings from towers built of stone. Churches fill quickly in better districts, fur collars, polished boots, breath warmed by expectation. Sermons speak of humility, of generosity, of the poor made holy by their suffering. The words land softly on padded pews. Charity is praised as a virtue, especially when it is orderly. Disorderly need is less welcome. The bells outside continue to ring, calling in more bodies, more bowed heads, more proof that London observes its rituals faithfully. Elsewhere, attendance is more complicated. For the poor, church is both refuge and judgment. Entering means warmth for an hour, perhaps, and the chance to be seen behaving correctly. It also means scrutiny eyes noting worn coats, empty hands, restless children. Sermons remind congregants that hardship is often the result of moral failure. Patience is urged, gratitude is demanded. Hunger is framed as a test of character rather than a fact of circumstance. Children hear the bells differently. They associate the sound with stillness, with being told to sit quietly despite gnawing emptiness. Knees pressed together, hands folded. The words spoken from the pulpit float above them, abstract and unreachable. Heaven is described in vivid detail, while earthly relief remains theoretical. They learn early that faith does not necessarily translate into food. In many homes, grace is still spoken over meals that barely qualify as such. A slice of bread, a thin porridge, something warm, if coal has been spared for cooking. The prayer acknowledges abundance even when it is absent. To omit it would be improper. To question it would be dangerous. So thanks are given carefully, for what is there and for what is promised, even if the promise has gone unfulfilled year after year. The bells continue their work, reinforcing order. They regulate time in a city where the poor have little control over it. Work schedules bend around them. Markets open and close by their sound. Even hunger seems to fall into rhythm, rising and receding in time with the day's demands. The bells offer structure where security is lacking, a framework within which suffering can be organized and therefore tolerated. Charitable efforts often align themselves with church calendars, a meal served after service, bread distributed under supervision. The act is public, intentional, and accompanied by reminders of obligation. Recipients are expected to listen, to nod, to absorb instruction along with nourishment. The food is real, but it is never just food. It carries meaning, expectation, and debt. Those who do not attend church are noted. Absence is interpreted as ingratitude or defiance. The bells ring for them as well, whether they wish to be counted or not. Their silence is still framed by sound, their empty bowls still surrounded by moral commentary they did not consent to but cannot escape. As Christmas Day unfolds, the bells reach their peak. They celebrate a birth meant to represent salvation, mercy, and divine generosity. Yet across the city, bowls remain empty long after the ringing fades. The sound does not linger with those it passes over. It moves on, echoing down streets where hunger sits quietly, unmoved by sermons and untouched by song. In Victorian London, the bells rang faithfully every December. They rang over rooftops heavy with soot, over rooms stiff with cold, over tables set with more intention than substance. They rang to remind the city of its soul. But they did not fill a single bowl. What London celebrated in December was not an ancient inheritance so much as a recent construction, assembled carefully and presented as tradition. The Victorian Christmas did not simply emerge from the past. It was shaped, edited, and polished into something usable. By the middle of the century, the season had acquired a recognizable form, decorations, customs, expectations, but much of it was new, and nearly all of it was selective. Earlier generations had known Christmas as a brief interruption, often noisy, sometimes unruly, and frequently ignored by industry. Work paused unevenly, revelry spilled into streets, and order loosened in ways authorities found uncomfortable. The Victorian era, obsessed with control and progress, could not allow such looseness to persist. If Christmas were to exist, it would have to behave. So it was softened, tamed, wrapped in moral language and domestic imagery. The holiday shifted inward, away from public chaos and into the private home. Celebration became quieter, cleaner, more respectable. The hearth replaced the street. The family replaced the crowd. What could not be controlled was rewritten. This new Christmas required symbols, objects that could communicate warmth without providing it. Evergreens signaled endurance. Candles suggested hope. Cards depicted idealized families gathered in rooms that bore no resemblance to most London housing. These images circulated widely, inexpensive enough to reach many, yet depicting a life only a few truly lived. They were aspirational rather than descriptive, invitations to imagine rather than mirrors of reality. Literature played its role. Stories began to frame Christmas as a time of moral reckoning resolved through kindness and personal transformation. Suffering existed in these tales, but only to be redeemed by generosity at the final hour. Hunger was temporary, poverty was curable, the poor were grateful, and the wealthy were benevolent. The ending mattered more than the accuracy. These narratives did not erase hardship, but they reframed it. If Christmas was kind by definition, then unkindness must be the fault of individuals rather than systems. If joy was available, then those who did not experience it must have failed to reach for it correctly. The invention of Christmas thus carried instruction as well as comfort. It taught people how to feel and how to judge. Public institutions followed suit. Churches emphasized domestic piety. Employers encouraged modest celebrations that reinforced loyalty rather than disruption. Charity organizations timed their efforts to the season, reinforcing the idea that generosity was exceptional, rather than necessary year-round. Christmas became a moment of sanctioned compassion, carefully bounded so it would not threaten the existing order. For the middle classes, this invented Christmas offered reassurance. It suggested stability in a rapidly changing world, a set of rituals that could anchor identity amid industrial noise and social anxiety. Decorating the home became an act of participation in something larger, proof of moral alignment. To celebrate properly was to belong. For the poor, the invention arrived as expectation without provision. They were invited into the idea of Christmas long before they were invited to its table. They were expected to observe, admire, and internalize its lessons, even when their lives contradicted its promises. The holiday spoke of family unity to those whose families were fractured by work, illness, or institutional separation. It spoke of abundance to those counting crumbs. Yet the power of the invention lay in its persistence. Over time, repetition gave it weight. What was new began to feel old. What was constructed began to feel inevitable. By the later Victorian years, to question Christmas itself seemed almost improper. It had become a moral landmark, a cultural certainty. And so the city embraced the idea, even as it failed the reality. London learned how to look festive, how to narrate kindness, how to package sentiment for public consumption. The invented Christmas did not feed the hungry or warm the cold, but it gave the city a story to tell itself, one in which hardship was acknowledged just enough to be redeemed and ignored just enough to continue. This was the Christmas that endured, not because it was true, but because it was useful. By December, London's greatest requirement was not joy, but performance. Cheer was expected, not felt. It was a posture, a discipline, a visible alignment with the season's rules. To appear content was to signal moral order. To fail at it was to invite suspicion. Respectability, in winter, demanded a smile set carefully against the cold. The expectation reached across class lines, though it weighed heaviest on those least able to carry it. In middle-class homes, cheer was rehearsed through ritual cards written, visits scheduled, modest gifts exchanged with studied restraint. Laughter arrived on cue. Gratitude was displayed politely, as though emotion itself could be managed like household accounts. Even melancholy, when allowed, was softened into reflection and quickly resolved. For the poor, the demand was harsher. Cheer became proof of deservingness. A grateful expression could mean the difference between receiving help and being turned away. Complaints were read as ingratitude. Silence was safer. To endure quietly was to behave correctly. To show distress was to fail a test no one admitted to administering. Children learned this lesson early. They were coached to say thank you for whatever arrived, however small or belated. A single orange, a scrap of cloth, a bowl of soup, ladled publicly and watched closely. Their faces were expected to light up, their voices to sound pleased. Any hesitation risked reprimand, not only from benefactors, but from parents who understood the stakes. Women bore the burden most visibly. Mothers were expected to maintain an atmosphere of calm, even when resources ran thin. The home, however cold or crowded, was to remain orderly, cheerful, proper. A woman who allowed despair to show was judged harshly, as though emotional control were a substitute for material support. Her ability to smile became evidence of her worth. Men, too, were caught in the performance. Unemployment in winter was common, but admitting anxiety was not. A man who appeared defeated threatened the image of industrious stability the season preferred. Pride and shame mixed uneasily, often driven inward and softened only by drink. Public cheer masked private fear, and the mask was rarely removed. The city reinforced this expectation at every turn. Newspapers published sentimental accounts of holiday generosity, celebrating individual acts of kindness while ignoring the conditions that made them necessary. Shop displays suggested abundance as a norm, Sermons praised contentment as a virtue. The message was consistent. Happiness was a choice, and choosing otherwise was a moral failure. Those who could not perform cheer were quietly marginalized. The visibly miserable were treated as disruptions to the seasonal order. Their presence complicated the story London wanted to tell itself. Beggars were tolerated more readily when they appeared humble and hopeful. Anger, despair, or accusation made people uncomfortable. Such emotions were out of season. Even death was expected to behave. Mourning during Christmas was permitted only if it remained subdued. Grief had to be tidy, folded neatly into prayer and patience. Excess sorrow threatened the illusion that the season healed all wounds. Those who lost family members in December were encouraged to find consolation in faith rather than question why winter took so many lives. This constant insistence on cheer created a strange tension beneath the surface of the city. Streets glittered while nerves frayed. Laughter rang out where exhaustion lingered. The performance required energy many did not have, and the effort of maintaining it deepened fatigue. To appear cheerful while hungry, cold, or ill was an act of quiet endurance that went largely unrecognized. Yet the rules held firm. Christmas demanded visible compliance. To participate correctly was to belong. To fail was to be marked. And so London smiled through chapped lips and empty rooms, insisting on celebration as proof of virtue. Beneath the gaslight glow, cheer became another form of labor, unpaid, relentless, and compulsory, performed not for joy, but for survival. By the later decades of the 19th century, Christmas traveled faster on paper than it ever did in practice. Printed cheer moved cheaply, efficiently, and without hunger. Cards passed through hands that never shook from cold. Illustrations reached rooms that would never resemble them. Ink and color carried warmth where coal and food did not. The Christmas card became one of the season's most powerful inventions. Small, affordable, and easily exchanged, it allowed participation without provision. A card required no feast, no fire, no rest from labor. It asked only to be received, admired, and perhaps pinned somewhere visible. In this way, Christmas could enter even the poorest homes, flattened, idealized, and utterly untouchable. The images repeated themselves endlessly. Snow falling softly on quiet streets untouched by soot, children laughing beside glowing hearths, tables arranged with abundance and symmetry, families gathered in rooms spacious enough to breathe. No overcrowding, no damp walls, no cough lingering in the background. These scenes did not reflect Victorian London. They corrected it. Printmakers understood their task well. They did not set out to deceive so much as to soothe. The city was anxious about class, about industry, about morality slipping beneath the weight of smoke and speed. Christmas imagery offered reassurance. It suggested that beneath the noise, a shared domestic ideal still existed, that somewhere life was ordered, warm, and kind. For those who lived far from such conditions, the effect was complicated. Cards were often treasured, saved carefully, reread year after year. They represented a possibility, however distant, but they also reinforced absence. Every detail highlighted what was missing. The more perfect the image, the sharper the contrast with reality. Children absorbed these pictures deeply. They learned what Christmas was supposed to look like long before they experienced anything like it. Their expectations were shaped by scenes they could not enter. When the day itself failed to match the promise, disappointment arrived quietly, often without words. Adults noticed but rarely explained. There was no language for the gap between representation and life. Newspapers joined in, publishing sentimental verses and engraved scenes that aligned perfectly with the season's invented tone. Hardship appeared only as a prelude, quickly resolved by generosity or divine intervention. Suffering was framed as temporary, instructive, and ultimately redeemable. Structural poverty was never depicted. Hunger had no place in the illustration unless it could be cured by the final paragraph. These printed comforts served an important social function. They allowed the middle and upper classes to imagine a harmonious city without confronting its fractures. To send or display such images was to affirm belief in a shared Christmas, even if that belief required ignoring evidence to the contrary. The act of circulation became a form of participation in the myth. Even charity relied on print to shape perception. Posters advertised seasonal giving with carefully chosen imagery, smiling recipients, grateful children, benevolent donors framed by light. The transaction appeared simple and satisfying. The complexities of need, shame, and dependence were smoothed away. A donation could purchase not only aid, but absolution. Over time, these images accumulated authority. Repetition gave them weight. What appeared often enough began to feel true, or at least inevitable. Memory itself became edited. When Victorians later recalled Christmas, they remembered the pictures as much as the experience. The paper version endured longer than the lived one, and so the city learned to see itself through these comfortable lies. London at Christmas became something one looked at rather than lived in. The gap between representation and reality widened, but the images held firm, reassuring and unchanging. They promised warmth without cost, joy without disruption, kindness without consequence. In rooms where the cold pressed close and the bowls remained empty, a card pinned to the wall offered a different world, quiet, complete, and unreachable. It did not lie maliciously, it lied gently, and in doing so, it helped the city endure what it could not yet correct. Beneath the garlands and printed cheer, Christmas in Victorian London followed a strict geography. It belonged to certain rooms, certain tables, certain lives. It travelled comfortably through drawing rooms and parlours, paused in shops and churches, and thinned noticeably as it moved outward. By the time it reached the margins of the city, it arrived altered, symbolic rather than sustaining, observed rather than experienced. For the wealthy, Christmas functioned as reassurance. It confirmed stability in a world that felt increasingly volatile. Industrial growth had reshaped the city at alarming speed, drawing crowds, smoke, and unrest into once quiet spaces. The Christmas home, carefully curated, stood as a defense against that chaos. It presented domestic order as a moral triumph. Clean rooms, measured generosity, controlled emotion. To celebrate Christmas correctly was to demonstrate fitness for leadership in a changing society. The middle classes embraced the season with particular intensity. Their position was newly earned and anxiously maintained. Christmas offered a script. They could follow a set of rituals that signaled respectability upward and benevolence downward. Hosting modest gatherings, exchanging tasteful gifts, and contributing to approved charities allowed them to participate fully without excess. The holiday affirmed their belonging in a social order still under construction. For these households, Christmas was about atmosphere as much as action. Warmth was cultivated deliberately, both physical and emotional. Time was taken off when possible. Children were indulged carefully, enough to signal affection but not enough to encourage softness. Gratitude was reinforced. Discipline remained intact. The season was framed as a reward for good conduct throughout the year. Outside this sphere, Christmas lost its privileges quickly. For labourers, domestic servants, and the unemployed, the holiday often passed with little material change. Work continued where it could. Employers decided who deserved a day's rest and who did not. Domestic servants observed celebrations from the edges of rooms they had prepared but did not share. Their presence was necessary, their participation optional. For the poorest Londoners, Christmas was not a destination but an interruption, brief, uneven, and often disappointing. They were invited to witness the season far more than to enjoy it. Street displays, shop windows, and church services offered constant reminders of a celebration happening elsewhere. The message was clear: Christmas existed, and it was not for everyone. Charity blurred the boundary but did not erase it. Seasonal giving allowed limited entry, carefully controlled. The poor could receive Christmas in portions: one meal, one gift, one supervised moment of relief. These offerings were framed as generosity, but they reinforced distance. Christmas was something bestowed, not shared. It confirmed who had the power to give and who was expected to receive with gratitude. Children felt this divide most sharply. They learned early which Christmas belonged to them and which did not. Some woke to rooms filled with warmth and anticipation. Others woke to the same cold they had known the day before, aware of festivities they could imagine but not claim. The lesson was subtle but lasting. Celebration followed status. Even within families, access varied. A household might manage a small indulgence for children, while adults went without. Or parents might eat less so a child could eat more, preserving the appearance of holiday normalcy at personal cost. Christmas, in these cases, was an exercise in concealment, making scarcity invisible for a single day. The city rarely questioned this distribution. Christmas was spoken of as universal, but practiced selectively. Its imagery suggested inclusion, while its logistics enforced separation. Those excluded were not considered victims of the holiday, but exceptions to it, people whose lives had not aligned properly with its requirements. And so, year after year, Victorian London rehearsed the same quiet truth. Christmas belonged most fully to those who already possessed comfort, time, and security. For everyone else, it was something to watch, admire, and endure, a season that promised unity while reminding the city exactly where its lines were drawn. This was who Christmas was actually for. December in Victorian London did not merely arrive with cold and ceremony, it arrived with judgment. The season functioned as an audit, a reckoning performed quietly but relentlessly, in which lives were weighed and sorted. Christmas asked not only who had enough, but who deserved it, and the answers were expected to align neatly with the city's moral arithmetic. Respectability became a ledger, behavior was tallied, habits were examined. The poor were measured not by circumstance but by conduct, their needs scrutinized for signs of failure. Industry counted in their favor. Idleness erased it. Sobriety earned approval. Drink annulled sympathy. Gratitude was required in advance, as proof that any assistance would not be wasted on ingratitude or rebellion. This accounting was not limited to institutions. It seeped into private homes and conversations, shaping how people spoke about one another. A struggling family might be described as unfortunate, a term that preserved dignity. Another, equally hungry, would be labeled undeserving, a word that closed doors. The difference often rested on rumor, appearance, or a single remembered transgression. Christmas sharpened these distinctions, bringing them into focus beneath the glow of seasonal virtue. Churches reinforced the calculus. Sermons spoke of stewardship and moral discipline, reminding congregants that charity must be guided by wisdom. To give indiscriminately was portrayed as dangerous, even sinful, an encouragement to vice. Better to give little, carefully, and with instruction. Better to correct than to comfort. The poor were framed as students in need of lesson rather than citizens in need of relief. Charitable organizations adopted similar language. Applications for aid required disclosure, explanation, and often confession. Applicants were asked to justify their hunger, to narrate their suffering in acceptable terms. Illness could be excused. Widowhood earned sympathy, disability allowed compassion. But poverty born of job loss, migration, or simple bad luck was treated with suspicion. The system demanded a reason it could recognize. Women were judged with particular severity. A mother's morality was examined as closely as her cupboards. Cleanliness mattered. Order mattered. The behavior of children reflected directly on her worth. A woman who failed to maintain an appearance of control, even under impossible conditions, risked losing access to aid. Christmas, with its emphasis on domestic virtue, intensified this scrutiny. The home became evidence. Men, too, were assessed, though differently. A man unable to provide during the season was seen as diminished, his masculinity quietly questioned. Workhouses filled with those who could not reconcile pride with hunger. Many chose silence over admission, enduring the cold rather than submit to the moral examination required for assistance. Christmas did not soften this pressure, it amplified it. Even the act of receiving help carried consequence. Those who accepted charity were expected to demonstrate reform, whether or not reform was relevant to their condition. Gratitude had to be visible and ongoing. A single lapse, a complaint, a refusal, a perceived lack of humility could undo months of compliance. Aid was conditional not only on need, but on continued performance. The wealthy, meanwhile, underwent a different accounting. Their generosity was measured publicly, often praised in print. Donations were noted, names were listed. Charity became a marker of character, a way to signal moral standing without questioning the structures that preserved wealth. Christmas offered a convenient opportunity to balance the books, to give just enough to feel absolved. This moral bookkeeping extended even into memory. Families remembered Christmases not only for what they had, but for what they believed they deserved. Children absorbed these lessons early, learning to associate worth with reward. The season taught them that kindness was selective, contingent, and monitored. It was not an entitlement, but an evaluation. By the end of December, the ledgers closed, aid withdrawn, attention shifted. The poor were expected to return quietly to endurance, their accounts settled until next winter. Christmas had done its work, reinforcing boundaries under the guise of goodwill. In Victorian London, the season was never neutral. It measured lives as much as it marked time, tallying virtue against hunger, obedience against warmth. And when the bells finally fell silent, the judgments remained entered carefully into the city's books, ready to be consulted again when the cold returned. Cold in Victorian London was not merely weather, it was infrastructure. It threaded itself through walls and laws alike, settling where protection thinned and retreating where resources gathered. December did not create it. December revealed it. The season made visible a condition that persisted all year, waiting only for winter to sharpen its edges. The city learned to live with cold as an expectation. Buildings were raised quickly, cheaply, and close together, their bricks holding damp as faithfully as they held heat. In wealthier districts, thickness and distance offered insulation, double walls, higher ceilings, space enough for fires to work. Elsewhere, rooms pressed against one another, sharing breath and moisture, surrendering warmth as fast as it could be made. Cold became communal there, passed from wall to wall, floor to ceiling, unchallenged. Fuel determined survival. Coal was counted, portioned, guarded. A family's winter plan often came down to arithmetic. How many hours of fire could be afforded? Which nights demanded heat? Which could be endured? The calculation was merciless. A longer burn meant less food. A warmer room meant thinner meals. Every choice carried consequence, and cold enforced them all. The body adapted, but adaptation carried cost. Fingers stiffened, joints ached, circulation slowed. Illness found opportunity in chilled lungs and weakened resistance. Doctors spoke of exposure as though it were incidental, a condition unfortunate but inevitable. They did not speak of architecture, wages, or fuel prices. Cold was framed as nature's imposition rather than society's arrangement. Clothing offered limited defense. Wool and layers helped, but they did not overcome rooms that never warmed. Coats were worn indoors, hats kept on at tables, gloves removed only when necessary. Sleep came fitfully beneath stacks of blankets that never quite held the heat. Morning brought relief only in movement, work as warmth, labor as circulation. Rest was colder. Children bore the constant most visibly. Their growth occurred against it, bones lengthening in chill rooms, hands reddening and cracking before they learned to write properly. Teachers noted inattention, lethargy, dullness traits attributed to character rather than temperature. A cold child was labeled lazy. A coughing child was labeled weak. The environment escaped scrutiny. Institutions mirrored the pattern. Schools, workhouses, hospitals, all rationed heat. Fires were lit by rule, not need. Warmth became a privilege administered by schedule. Patients shivered beneath thin covers while wards smelled faintly of antiseptic and damp stone. Recovery slowed, mortality rose quietly. Cold did not appear on death certificates, but it shaped many of them. Meanwhile, warmth gathered elsewhere. Clubs, theatres, private homes glowed steadily. Their fires fed without pause. There, cold existed as something to be excluded, an enemy successfully repelled. The contrast was stark and instructive. Warmth signaled belonging. Cold marked exclusion. The city's geography could be traced by temperature alone. Christmas did little to alter this reality. If anything, it emphasized it. The season's imagery promised warmth as a shared experience, but the distribution remained uneven. Those already cold felt the promise more keenly and the failure more deeply. The idea of universal cheer clashed with bodies that could not stop shaking. Over time, cold became moralized. Enduring it quietly was praised. Complaining about it suggested weakness. To suffer without protest was framed as fortitude, even virtue. This language allowed the city to admire endurance rather than question why it was required. Cold became character building, its persistence justified by the lessons it supposedly taught. Yet the lessons were cruelly consistent. Winter returned each year, and the same households bore it again. Children grew into adults already shaped by exposure. Their tolerance was mistaken for resilience. Their shortened lives went largely unnoticed. In Victorian London, cold was not an accident. It was patterned, predictable, and persistent. It settled where power did not reach, and lifted where it did. Christmas illuminated this truth briefly, before retreating into myth, but the cold remained steady, impartial in appearance, and profoundly unequal in effect, a constant reminder of where the city's warmth truly belonged. Some rooms in Victorian London were never meant to be warm. They were built to contain bodies, not comfort them, spaces calculated for density, not rest. By December, their purpose became unmistakable. Cold did not enter these rooms so much as reside in them, settled permanently into brick, floorboards, and air. Tenement housing multiplied rapidly as the city expanded, erected quickly to meet demand, and just as quickly neglected. Walls were thin, often damp, absorbing moisture from the ground and releasing it slowly into living space. Fireplaces, when present at all, were shallow and inefficient. Their heat lost upward through flues that drew warmth away faster than it could be produced. Windows rattled in their frames, admitting drafts that cut across beds and tables alike. In these rooms, heat never accumulated. A fire might flare briefly, offering the illusion of relief, but the warmth dissipated within minutes of dying down. Families learned not to expect lasting change. They gathered close when the flames were lit, then separated reluctantly as cold reclaimed the space. The rhythm repeated daily, a cycle of hope and retreat. Furniture absorbed the chill. Chairs were cold to the touch. Tables felt damp even when dry. Bedding never fully warmed, no matter how long one lay beneath it. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by shivering or the sound of coughing echoing off bare walls. Morning brought no renewal, only movement enough to restore circulation. Children adapted first. They slept curled tightly, limbs drawn inward instinctively, conserving what little heat their bodies produced. Their breath formed clouds in the dark. Adults noticed and adjusted where possible, offering extra layers, positioning beds away from walls, blocking drafts with rags or paper. These efforts helped marginally. The room always won. Cooking, when it happened, doubled as heating. Pots were left on the fire longer than necessary, not for flavor, but for warmth. Meals stretched out in time, eaten slowly to prolong proximity to the flame. Even so, the cold returned as soon as dishes were cleared. The room resumed its equilibrium, low temperature, high, damp, unyielding. Illness thrived here. Respiratory complaints lingered, turning minor colds into chronic conditions. Doctors visiting such homes often remarked on the air, noting its heaviness, its smell. They prescribed tonics, rest, and better nutrition recommendations impossible to fulfill within walls that never warmed. The room itself was the ailment, but no remedy addressed it. Privacy was scarce. Entire families shared single spaces, their breath compounding the damp, their movements stirring drafts. Infants slept beside grandparents. Adults dressed and undressed in shifts, guarding modesty where possible. The closeness did not bring warmth so much as endurance, bodies sharing cold rather than dispelling it. Christmas passed through these rooms quietly. Decorations, if present, were minimal, a paper star, a sprig of greenery pinned above a door. Candles were lit briefly and extinguished carefully, flame too precious to waste. The idea of a glowing hearth belonged elsewhere. Here, fire was utilitarian, rationed, never ornamental. Visitors from warmer homes often misunderstood these spaces. They mistook silence for calm, stillness for peace. They did not feel the cold long enough to recognize it as constant. Their coats shielded them temporarily. Their departure restored the room's usual state. Sympathy, when offered, remained abstract. For those who lived there, the room defined the season more than any calendar. Winter was not a date, but a condition. It arrived early, lingered late, and shaped daily behavior. Children learned to play quietly, to conserve energy. Adults planned movements carefully to minimize exposure. Everything slowed. These rooms did not make headlines. They were not photographed or illustrated in holiday prints. They existed beneath the city's festive surface, holding lives that adapted to cold rather than escaping it. And when Christmas ended and attention shifted elsewhere, the rooms remained unchanged, still damp, still dim, still unwarmed, waiting patiently for another winter to arrive. As it always did, hunger did not announce itself loudly to Victorian children. It arrived quietly, folded into routine, becoming familiar long before it was fully understood. By the time winter deepened, many children no longer asked when the next meal would come. They had learned, instinctively, not to. Hunger was not an emergency, it was an expectation. December sharpened it. School hours shortened with fading light, but food did not increase to compensate. Breakfast, when it existed at all, was thin and functional, something warm if coal allowed, something solid if luck intervened. Many children left home with nothing in their stomachs, carrying the hollow sensation with them into classrooms that smelled of ink, damp coats, and unheated air. Teachers noticed the signs, though rarely named them as hunger: slowness, distraction, heads lowered onto desks, hands that trembled when asked to write. These were interpreted as faults of character or discipline. A child who could not concentrate was assumed lazy. A child who slept was reprimanded. The body's quiet signals were drowned out by moral instruction. At home, meals were structured carefully around scarcity. Children learned to eat slowly, to chew deliberately, to savor what little there was. They learned which days were better than others, which pots held promise, and which held disappointment. They watched their parents make decisions they could not yet name, who would eat less so someone else could eat more. These lessons were absorbed without explanation. Hunger altered behavior subtly. Children became watchful. They noticed food wherever it appeared, even when it was not meant for them. The smell of baking from a neighbor's window, a dropped crust in the street, a stall closing at market's end. They learned where scraps might be found, which routes offered possibility, which doors were safest to knock. Christmas complicated this knowledge. The season promised indulgence, and children understood promises acutely. Stories, pictures, and school lessons described abundance as normal, expected, deserved. When reality failed to match, the discrepancy lodged deeply. Some children waited quietly, convinced relief would arrive at the proper hour. Others learned to lower expectations early, protecting themselves from disappointment by refusing to hope too much. Charitable gifts, when they came, were remembered for years. A piece of fruit, a small toy, a meal served in a public hall. These moments stood out not for their generosity alone, but for their rarity. They proved that fullness was possible, if fleeting. The memory lingered long after the hunger returned. Illness followed hunger closely. Bodies deprived of steady nourishment struggled to resist winter's assaults. Coughs persisted, wounds healed slowly, growth stalled. Doctors might remark on a child's thinness, recommending better diet without addressing how such improvement might be achieved. Hunger was noted, then dismissed as unfortunate rather than preventable. Emotionally, hunger shaped temperament. Some children grew quiet and inward, conserving energy and speech. Others became restless, irritable, quick to anger. These traits were judged without context. A hungry child was labeled difficult. The cause remained invisible or was deliberately ignored. Parents watched this unfolding with a particular kind of helplessness. They knew the signs as well as any physician. They felt the weight of responsibility keenly, even when circumstances lay beyond their control. Christmas heightened this pain. To be unable to provide during a season defined by provision was a wound that did not close easily. And yet, children adapted. They always did. Hunger became part of their understanding of the world, woven into memory alongside lessons and lullabies. It taught them early about limits, about patience, about the distance between promise and reality. These were not lessons chosen for them, but lessons learned all the same. In Victorian London, childhood did not shield against want. It introduced it. Hunger arrived early, stayed long, and shaped lives quietly, one winter at a time. The idea of a Christmas meal hovered over Victorian London like a scent that refused to settle. It was spoken of with certainty, described in detail, rehearsed in sermons and stories, yet absent from countless tables. For many households, the meal existed only as an expectation, something discussed, anticipated, and quietly abandoned as the day approached. Preparation began with hope, a careful counting of coins, a visit to the market to assess what might be possible if prices dipped or charity intervened. Families watched stalls with the patience of gamblers, waiting for the moment when unsold goods might be marked down. The longer they waited, the colder it grew, and the more the odds turned against them. Meat was the central symbol, the marker that distinguished a Christmas meal from an ordinary one. To serve it was to participate fully in the season. To go without was to remain outside its boundaries. For the poor, meat was rare even in good months. In December, it became almost mythical, birds hanging just out of reach, joints displayed like trophies of another life. The sight was both invitation and insult. Many families planned substitutions long before admitting defeat. A broth thickened slightly more than usual, bread cut into smaller pieces but served with ceremony, a pudding made from whatever could be spared, heavy on starch, light on sweetness. These efforts were not deception so much as adaptation. The ritual mattered, even when the substance did not match the script. Children watched closely. They sensed the significance of the day and the strain it imposed. Questions were asked cautiously, then not at all. When the meal failed to materialize, disappointment was absorbed quietly, folded into the same discipline that governed hunger the rest of the year. Parents apologized with looks rather than words, their own appetite already surrendered. Charitable meals offered temporary relief but also distance. Served in halls or institutions, they removed the act of eating from the home, from family control. Attendance required compliance, lining up, waiting, accepting whatever was given without complaint. The food was real, sometimes generous, but the setting reinforced dependency. It was a Christmas meal, but not theirs. For those who did not attend, the day passed much like any other winter day, marked only by the awareness that it was meant to be different. Pots remained empty, or nearly so. Fires were lit briefly, if at all. The smell of other people's cooking drifted through shared walls, a reminder of proximity without access. Hunger sharpened under the weight of expectation. The absence of the meal carried emotional consequence. Christmas was meant to be proof of care, of continuity, of belonging. When the meal never came, it suggested failure not of appetite, but of status. Families felt themselves measured and found lacking. The city offered no language to separate celebration from worth, so the two collapsed into one another. Memory preserved these moments vividly. Adults recalled years later the Christmas when nothing changed, when the day passed without remark. The memory was not always bitter, but it was clear. It marked an understanding of limits, a recognition that the promises of the season did not extend universally. Meanwhile, accounts of lavish meals circulated freely, reinforcing the norm rather than the exception. Newspapers printed menus meant to inspire, not to reflect. The Christmas meal became a cultural constant, even as its absence was quietly widespread. Silence covered the gap. In Victorian London, the Christmas meal was less a guarantee than a test one many could not pass. It arrived where resources already existed and failed where they did not. And when the day ended and the dishes were cleared or never filled at all, the hunger that followed felt heavier for having been postponed by hope. The meal that never came lingered long after the season ended, a quiet reminder of where the city's generosity began and where it stopped. Cheer, when it reached the poorer quarters of Victorian London, rarely arrived new. It came worn, passed along, altered by many hands before it reached its final destination. This was not the cheer of abundance, but of survival patched together from leftovers, softened by necessity, and accepted with careful gratitude. Second-hand cheer began with objects, decorations salvaged from previous years, paper stars faded by smoke, ribbon reused until the fibers thinned and frayed, a sprig of greenery taken from a public railing or discarded market crate, pinned carefully above a door as proof of participation. These items carried history with them, their imperfections visible, their value symbolic rather than material. Clothing followed the same pattern. Children wore coats, inherited from older siblings or neighbors, sleeves turned back, hems let down where possible. Boots were repaired repeatedly, leather stiffened and cracked but still serviceable. Christmas outfits, when they existed, were rarely new. They were reassigned, reimagined, made to fit through effort rather than expense. Appearance mattered. It signaled effort, respectability, and a willingness to conform. Gifts, too, traveled this route. Toys passed from child to child, cleaned and presented again with fresh promise. A doll missing an eye, a wooden horse worn smooth by years of play. These items were not mocked, they were cherished. Their survival mirrored that of the children who received them. Newness was less important than presence. Food, when shared, was often second-hand as well. Leftovers from charitable dinners, bread distributed at the end of market days, puddings donated from households that had more than they could eat. These offerings carried warmth, but also reminder. They were evidence of another table, another fire, another life. Gratitude was required, and usually given sincerely, but the distance remained. Second-hand cheer extended into behavior. Laughter borrowed from stories, songs learned from church or school, repeated until they felt personal. Smiles practiced carefully, drawn from observation rather than impulse. Children learned how to perform Christmas by imitation, modeling joy they had seen illustrated or described. The performance mattered as much as the feeling. Parents facilitated this process quietly. They framed scarcity as normal. They emphasized effort over outcome. A carefully set table, even with little on it, became an achievement. Candles were lit briefly, not for light but for ritual. The gesture itself was the gift. These acts transformed absence into participation, however fragile. Yet second-hand cheer carried weight. It reminded families of what they did not have, even as it allowed them to belong. The cheer was conditional, dependent on external generosity or prior use. It did not renew itself. Each year required fresh improvisation, fresh restraint. There was no accumulation, only continuation. Visitors from wealthier areas sometimes misread this cheer. They praised ingenuity, resilience, spirit. They admired the way people made do, as though making do were a choice rather than a requirement. The patched decorations were seen as quaint, not desperate. The effort was acknowledged, but the cause was not examined. Children internalized this dynamic deeply. They learned to accept what came without complaint. They learned to find joy in what endured rather than what arrived. This skill served them later, though it was learned at cost. Second-hand cheer taught them flexibility, patience, and emotional economy. It also taught them their place. As the day ended, the cheer faded quickly. Decorations were removed or stored carefully for reuse. Food disappeared. Candles were extinguished early to preserve resources. The room returned to its usual state, cold, dim, functional. The cheer had been borrowed, not owned. In Victorian London, second-hand cheer allowed the city to extend Christmas outward without altering its structure. It created the appearance of inclusion while preserving distance. Those who lived with it understood its limits intimately. It was enough to get through the day. It was never enough to change the season. And when winter pressed on, as it always did, second-hand cheer became memory, something remembered fondly, even gratefully, but recognized for what it was. A kindness passed along, never meant to last. Winter gathered bodies the way fog gathered streets, quietly, persistently, without asking permission. By December, illness moved through Victorian London with practiced ease, finding purchase wherever cold lingered longest and nourishment thinned first. The season did not introduce sickness so much as invite it to stay. Coughs arrived early and rarely left. They settled into chests, already strained by smoke and damp, turning minor discomfort into constant companion. In narrow rooms where air scarcely moved, breath was shared repeatedly, each exhalation carrying more than warmth. Children learned the sound of sickness before they learned its cause, the hollow rattle, the wet pause between breaths, the night-long rhythm that meant sleep would be broken again. Doctors called it seasonal, an expected rise, a predictable consequence of cold air and weak constitutions. They noted cases in ledgers, prescribed tonics that burned the throat, advised rest that could not be afforded, better food, cleaner air, warmth. Recommendations repeated so often they lost meaning. The conditions remained unchanged. The advice endured anyway. In working neighborhoods, illness was managed rather than treated. A fever meant a day lost to labor, a cost weighed carefully before a body was allowed to stop. Parents worked until movement became impossible. Children were sent to school unless they collapsed. To acknowledge sickness was to risk losing income, housing, or favor. Many endured quietly, hoping the body would recover before circumstances worsened. Hospitals offered little refuge. Overcrowded and underheated, their wards smelled of disinfectant and damp stone. Fires were rationed, blankets were thin. Patients lay in rows, separated by inches, their ailments blending into one continuous presence. Recovery was slow. Death, when it came, was often attributed to weakness rather than environment. Christmas heightened the strain. The expectation of cheer did not pause for fever. Those who fell ill during the season did so without ceremony. There were no allowances for missing work or celebrations. Illness disrupted the performance of normalcy, and so it was minimized wherever possible. A cough was ignored, a chill endured. Only when the body failed completely did attention follow. Children suffered disproportionately. Their smaller frames lost heat quickly, their immune defenses undermined by hunger and exposure. Scarlet fever, measles, influenza, names spoken with resignation rather than alarm. Families recognized patterns, which winters took the youngest, which spared them. Survival felt arbitrary, a matter of timing and fortune rather than care. The elderly fared little better. Those who had spent decades breathing smoke and laboring without rest found their reserves depleted. Cold, stiffened joints already worn thin. Circulation slowed. A single infection could tip the balance. Death notices increased in December, printed in small type, beneath advertisements for holiday goods. The proximity was unremarked upon. Religious language softened the reality. Illness was framed as trial, death as passage. Comfort was offered in the promise of elsewhere, later. This allowed the city to endure loss without addressing cause. The season of goodwill did not extend to reform. Sickness was part of winter's character, and winter was treated as inevitable. Families marked illness privately. They kept vigil through long nights, tending fires that refused to warm, listening to breathing that might or might not steady by morning. Christmas passed quietly in such homes, acknowledged only by the calendar. Decorations went unpinned. Meals were skipped. Survival became the sole objective. When recovery came, it did so gradually, leaving weakness behind. When it did not, grief followed the same restrained patterns as hunger and cold. Mourning was folded neatly into routine. There was little time for collapse. Winter pressed on, indifferent to individual loss. By January, the city would tally its dead and move forward. The seasonal peak would pass and attention would shift. But the pattern remained, ready to repeat. Illness in Victorian London was not an interruption. It was an expected outcome of cold, crowding, and neglect. Christmas illuminated it briefly, then allowed it to fade back into the background, unnamed and unchanged. The bells rang, the cards circulated, the season declared itself generous, and beneath it all, bodies failed quietly, one winter at a time. In winter, silence became a resource, and mothers were its careful stewards. They learned how to stretch it the way others stretched bread, thin, deliberate, never wasted. In Victorian London, a mother's labour did not end with cooking or cleaning. It extended into the management of absence. Hunger, fear, and cold were not merely endured, they were edited. Silence began at the table. When portions were small, conversation grew smaller still. Words cost energy, and energy was better saved. Children were taught to eat without remark, to accept what appeared before them as complete. Questions about seconds were gently deflected, then quietly discouraged. A mother's glance could carry instruction without sound. In that look lived reassurance and warning together. This is all there is, and we will manage. Mothers learned to move through rooms without drawing attention to lack. They rearranged objects to suggest order where little existed, plates aligned carefully, blankets folded with intention, a single candle placed where it implied warmth beyond its reach. These gestures mattered. They created the appearance of control, which in turn created calm. Panic, once allowed, spread quickly. Silence kept it contained. Children sensed the effort even when they did not name it. They noticed how their mothers ate last, or not at all, how a cup was set down unfinished so another might drink, how hunger was reframed as tiredness, cold as briskness, fear as patience. These translations were performed daily, without applause, without acknowledgement. The work was invisible by design. Mothers also managed the silence of illness. When a child coughed through the night, worry was kept internal, voiced only in whispered prayers or not at all. Panic would not help. The city offered little response to maternal alarm, and so alarm was suppressed. Fever was monitored quietly. Breath counted silently. Decisions were made alone in the dark, weighed against costs that no one else would share. Charity visits tested this discipline. Inspectors and benefactors read homes closely, listening for disorder as much as observing it. A mother who spoke too freely risked judgment. Complaints could be interpreted as ingratitude. Silence, again, was safest. Needs were presented carefully, stripped of emotion, framed as temporary and undesired. Pride was preserved not for vanity, but for survival. The pressure to maintain silence intensified at Christmas. The season demanded cheer, and mothers became its primary enforcers. They encouraged smiles where disappointment threatened. They redirected attention from what was missing to what could be admired. A small decoration became an event. A simple meal became a ceremony. These reframings required constant vigilance, a mental labor as exhausting as any physical task. Grief, too, was managed this way. Losses common in winter, children, infants, elders were mourned within tight boundaries. Excess sorrow disrupted the household's fragile balance. Tears were saved for moments alone, wiped away before mourning. Life did not pause for mourning, and neither could the women responsible for keeping it moving. Outsiders often misunderstood this quiet. They mistook it for strength without cost, resilience without sacrifice. They praised stoicism without recognizing what it consumed. Silence protected families, but it also isolated them. Mothers carried knowledge they could not share, fears they could not voice, calculations they could not explain. The silence stretched thin, but it held. By spring, when cold loosened its grip and attention shifted elsewhere, the silence remained. It had become habit. Children grew accustomed to reading it, to sensing meaning in what was not said. Mothers continued to ration speech as they had rationed food, measuring each word against necessity. In Victorian London, silence was not emptiness, it was work. And mothers, unseen and uncelebrated, performed it daily, stretching it across hunger and winter, holding families together with restraint, so practiced it passed unnoticed. Christmas morning did not still the machinery of Victorian London. The city woke, as it always did, early, cold, and impatient. While church bells rang and parlours prepared their rituals, thousands of men rose before dawn, pulling on coats stiff with yesterday's frost, stepping back into streets that had no intention of honouring the calendar. For them, Christmas was not a pause, it was a complication. Work followed need, not tradition. Factories ran when orders demanded it. Docks opened with the tide. Rail yards obeyed timetables that did not acknowledge holy days. A man's absence could mean lost wages, and lost wages could not be recovered by sentiment. The decision to work on Christmas Day was rarely a decision at all. It was the only option that preserved rent, coal, and the fragile equilibrium of a household already stretched thin. Fathers moved quietly that morning. Children slept, or pretended to. Wives watched from doorways, wrapping scarves tighter, offering brief words meant to steady rather than console. There was no ceremony in departure. The city provided none. Men slipped back into labor as if the day were ordinary, though they knew it was not. The knowledge lingered like a bruise beneath the skin. In workshops, the atmosphere was subdued but relentless. The clatter of tools and hiss of steam carried on, indifferent to the date. Some employers offered token concessions, shortened hours, a mug of ale, a word of thanks. Others offered nothing at all. Gratitude, when expressed, was expected to suffice in place of rest. A man who complained risked being marked as unreliable, ungrateful, replaceable. The irony was not lost on those who labored. They heard the bells from factory windows. They passed decorated shop fronts on their way to shifts that erased any sense of holiday. The city's celebration unfolded just beyond reach, visible and inaccessible. Christmas existed around them, not for them. For many fathers, the absence cut deeper than fatigue. To work on Christmas meant missing the small moments that defined the day, the careful unwrapping of second-hand gifts, the lighting of a candle, the quiet meal stretched thin but shared. These moments mattered precisely because they were rare. Missing them felt like another subtraction, another proof that time itself was unevenly distributed. Some men carried guilt with them to work, heavier than tools. They knew their labor was necessary, but necessity did not erase longing. They imagined their children waiting, counting hours. They pictured wives maintaining cheer, managing silence, holding the household together alone. The knowledge sharpened the cold rather than dulling it. Others hardened themselves against the feeling. They framed work as duty, sacrifice as virtue. Providing, even imperfectly, became a shield against regret. This narrative offered structure, if not comfort. It allowed men to endure the day without breaking beneath its contradictions. Christmas wages, when paid at all, were rarely generous. There was no universal bonus, no guarantee of compensation for lost celebration. The economy did not reward observance. It rewarded continuity. Men returned home later than usual, hands raw, bodies exhausted, faces marked by soot and strain. The day's work lingered on them, visible even after washing. At home, the reunion was often quiet. The moment for celebration had passed, or been postponed indefinitely. A shared meal, if it happened, was subdued. Children learned to contain excitement, to match the tone of the room. Mothers recalibrated plans on the fly, shifting rituals to accommodate absence. Christmas adapted, as it always did, around labor. The city praised industriousness, even on holy days. Sermons extolled duty. Newspapers celebrated productivity. The image of the working man, steady, silent, reliable, was held up as a moral ideal. Yet the cost of that ideal was borne privately, absorbed into family life without acknowledgement. In Victorian London, Christmas did not suspend the rules of survival. It exposed them. Fathers at work on Christmas Day embodied the truth beneath the season's glow, that celebration was contingent, rest was conditional, and time itself was a privilege unevenly granted. When the day ended and the machines finally slowed, the city moved on, and the work of endurance resumed unchanged by the holiday it had briefly circled and left behind. When the cold pressed too close and the rooms refused to hold heat, another kind of warmth waited behind wooden doors and fogged windows. It did not glow like a hearth or linger like coal. It flared briefly, then faded. In Victorian London, alcohol offered itself as both comfort and disguise, a liquid answer to questions winter asked too insistently. Public houses thickened along working streets, their lamps burning late, their doors swinging open to admit men whose hands had stiffened around tools all day. Inside, the air was warmer, dense with smoke, sweat, and the sweet bite of spirits. Ale and gin promised relief, not from hunger or cold exactly, but from the constant awareness of them. For a few coins, the body loosened, the edges softened, the night seemed survivable. Drink was cheaper than coal, quicker than charity, and asked no questions. It did not inspect a home or tally behavior. It did not demand gratitude or reform. It offered its warmth immediately, coursing through limbs starved of it, convincing the drinker briefly that winter had retreated. This illusion was powerful and dangerous and widely understood. Men drank to steady themselves after labor that never truly paused. Women drank to quiet nerves stretched thin by management of scarcity. In cramped rooms where children slept close, a sip before bed could dull the ache of responsibility long enough to rest. The practice was common, though rarely spoken of kindly. Society judged the act even as it benefited from the silence it produced. Moral reformers watched these patterns closely. Pamphlets circulated warning of drink's corrupting influence, its role in poverty and vice. They framed alcohol as cause rather than symptom, a convenient narrative that redirected attention from wages, housing, and fuel. Winter drinking was condemned as weakness, even as winter itself remained unchallenged. The poor understood the contradiction intimately. They knew the warmth was false, that it would leave them colder later. They knew the cost, both in coin and consequence. And yet, on nights when the fire had gone out and sleep refused to come, the choice felt less moral than practical. Endurance required tools. Alcohol was one of them. Christmas intensified this dynamic. The season licensed excess in certain quarters while condemning it in others. The wealthy indulged openly, their drinking framed as conviviality. The poor drank discreetly, their consumption scrutinized and pathologized. A glass raised in a parlor signaled celebration. The same glass in a tenement signaled failure. Public houses became temporary refuges on Christmas night, especially for those whose homes offered little relief. Men lingered longer than usual, stretching coins across hours, delaying the return to cold rooms. Songs were sung, stories repeated. Laughter rose and fell unevenly. For a while, the city's demands receded. The warmth felt communal, shared among strangers equally chilled. But the morning always returned, and with it, judgment. Drunkenness was recorded by authorities, noted by employers, remembered by neighbors. A man seen drinking too much risked reputation as well as wages. A woman risked something harsher, moral condemnation that followed her long after the effects wore off. The same substance that offered escape also tightened scrutiny. Children observed this exchange silently. They learned early what drink represented and what it cost. Some associated it with rare moments of ease, others with tension and unpredictability. Winter evenings taught them that warmth could be borrowed, but never kept. That relief arrived with conditions. The city spoke often of temperance but offered few alternatives. Warm public spaces were scarce, private warmth was expensive. Alcohol filled a gap left intentionally unaddressed. Its presence revealed not moral collapse, but structural neglect, a solution allowed because it kept suffering contained and private. By January, reformers renewed their campaigns, citing holiday excess as evidence. The poor returned to endurance, the pubs to routine. The cycle continued, unchanged. Winter would come again, and with it, the same calculations. In Victorian London, alcohol was neither simple vice nor simple comfort. It was a response to cold that society refused to solve, a warmth that burned quickly and left its mark. And when the glow faded, winter remained patient, impartial, and waiting. December carried its own arithmetic, and the city learned to read it in small print. Death notices multiplied as the days shortened, appearing quietly in newspapers beneath advertisements for winter goods and holiday offerings. They were brief, restrained, and frequent enough to become familiar. Names, ages, addresses, sometimes a cause, often not. The season recorded its losses without ceremony. Victorian London expected more deaths in winter. The pattern was known, accepted, and largely unchallenged. Cold, weakened bodies already strained by hunger, labor, and smoke. Illness spread more easily through crowded rooms, sealed against the air. The vulnerable, the very young, the very old, the chronically ill were claimed first. By December, The city had learned not to be surprised. Families read the notices carefully, scanning for familiar names. Recognition arrived with a tightening in the chest, followed by relief when the line ended without confirmation. Survival was measured comparatively. To make it through another winter felt less like success than temporary reprieve. Loss was always nearby, waiting for a lapse in heat, food, or strength. Funerals followed quickly. There was little time to linger in grief when burial arrangements had to be made and wages could not be spared. Black crepe appeared on doors and sleeves, modest and efficient. Mourning clothes were often borrowed or reused, their significance understood even when their quality was poor. The city recognized grief as part of winter's routine. Children encountered death early and often. They learned the language of loss alongside the language of hunger. A neighbor gone, a schoolmate missing, a cradle emptied. Explanations were brief, shaped to soothe rather than inform. God's will, weak constitution, the cold. These phrases offered closure without clarity, allowing life to continue without questions that had no acceptable answers. Hospitals and workhouses contributed their own quiet tallies. Wards emptied and refilled. Beds changed occupants without pause. Clerks updated ledgers with practiced hands, recording outcomes rather than causes. Death was categorized, archived, and absorbed into institutional memory. It did not disrupt operations. It confirmed expectations. Christmas did not halt this process. If anything, it intensified the contrast. While cards circulated and sermons promised renewal, hearses moved through the same streets, their passage barely noted. Bells rang for celebration and for burial with equal authority. The sound differed little. Only the context shifted. For families experiencing loss in December, the season acquired a permanent association. Future Christmases carried echoes of that winter, the absence resurfacing each year with renewed clarity. Joy and grief coexisted uneasily, the former never fully displacing the latter. The city offered no guidance for reconciling the two. Individuals managed as best they could. Newspapers rarely dwelled on these deaths unless they could be framed as cautionary tales. An elderly person succumbing to exposure, a child lost to illness. These accounts served as reminders of vulnerability, but not as prompts for reform. The emphasis rested on inevitability rather than responsibility. Winter killed, that was its nature. Yet the pattern was not random. Death clustered where cold persisted, where food thinned, where labor exhausted bodies beyond recovery. The geography of loss mirrored the geography of deprivation. The city understood this in practice, if not in principle. The notices told the story, even when no one chose to read it that way. Gravediggers worked steadily through December, their labor as essential and uncelebrated as any other. Cemeteries filled slowly, methodically, the earth hardened, resisting spade and shovel. Burial took longer, the work heavier. Winter demanded effort even in death. By the time the year turned, the tally was complete. The city moved on, counting its survivors and adjusting to new absences. The dead were remembered privately, if at all. Public attention shifted to resolution and reform, promises rarely kept beyond words. In Victorian London, death notices in December were not anomalies. They were seasonal markers, as predictable as frost. They passed through the city quietly, embedded in routine, reminding those who noticed that winter always took its share and that the taking was rarely questioned, only endured. Sound traveled strangely in winter. Cold air carried it farther. Thinner walls failed to stop it, and yet much of it went unanswered. In Victorian London, crying was one of the season's most common sounds, present, persistent, and carefully ignored. It moved through tenements and row houses alike, threading itself into the city's nighttime rhythm. Behind walls shared by too many bodies, children cried first. Hunger made its demands known in the small hours when distraction failed and sleep would not come. The sound was sharp at first, then dulled into whimpers as exhaustion took hold. Parents listened in silence, counting breaths, waiting for the wave to pass. Comfort could be offered, but not always relief. Holding a child did not fill a stomach. Silence, again, became the only available tool. Mothers learned to distinguish between cries that required intervention and those that must be endured. This was not cruelty. It was triage. Some sounds meant illness, others meant fear, others meant the body protesting conditions it could not yet understand. Responding to every cry was impossible. Choosing when not to respond carried its own weight, borne quietly and alone. Neighbors heard these sounds clearly. In tightly packed housing, walls were thin, floors thinner. A crying child could be traced room to room, its source obvious to anyone listening. Yet doors remained closed, not from indifference, but from recognition. Everyone understood what the sound meant. Everyone had heard it before. Intervention was rare because solutions were rarer still. Adult crying was less common, but more carefully concealed. When it occurred, it happened behind closed doors, muffled by cloth, or swallowed entirely. Tears were considered dangerous evidence of weakness that could invite judgment or exploitation. A woman heard weeping risked scrutiny. A man heard crying risked shame. Silence protected reputation even as it intensified isolation. Illness amplified these sounds. Fevered children cried differently, their voices thinner, more urgent. Night-long vigils were common, punctuated by whispered reassurances and prayers. Neighbors recognized the pattern, listened for changes. Silence following such nights was often interpreted with dread. Mourning brought confirmation or relief. Sometimes both. Christmas did not soften these sounds. If anything, it sharpened them. Expectations weighed heavily on households already strained. Children aware of celebration elsewhere cried from confusion as much as hunger. Adults struggled to maintain calm beneath pressure to perform cheer. The walls held these tensions in, turning each room into a chamber of private endurance. Charitable visits rarely acknowledged this reality. Aid focused on visible need, empty cupboards, thin clothing, cold rooms. Sound did not factor into assessments. Crying left no mark that could be recorded or corrected. It lingered only in memory, uncounted and unaddressed. The city learned to live with this background noise. It became part of winter's character, like wind through broken panes or carts rattling over frozen streets. The sound did not provoke action, because action would have required acknowledgement of scale. It was easier to treat each cry as isolated, personal, unavoidable. Children who grew up with this sound internalized it. They learned when to cry and when not to. They learned how long was acceptable, how quietly one must protest. Many learned to stop altogether, conserving energy, conserving dignity. Crying, like hunger, became something to manage privately. Adults carried the memory forward. Years later, the sound of a child crying in winter could trigger unease, disproportionate to the moment. It recalled nights without solution, walls that held sound but not heat, and the knowledge that suffering could be both audible and unanswered. In Victorian London, walls were meant to separate households, but they also connected them through shared endurance. Crying moved freely between rooms, reminding everyone of what lay on the other side lives much like their own, stretched thin by the same season. The city did not respond to these sounds, it absorbed them, and as winter deepened, the crying continued, behind walls that heard everything and offered nothing back. By late December, kindness in Victorian London acquired conditions. Charity did not move freely. It passed through filters, paused for judgment, and emerged altered. The season spoke often of generosity, but beneath the language of goodwill lay a quieter sermon one preached not always from pulpits, but from offices, homes, and institutions alike. It asked a single question, repeated endlessly in different forms: who deserves it? The idea of deservingness shaped every act of winter relief. Aid was never simply a response to need, it was a verdict. Hunger alone did not qualify a family for help. Cold alone was insufficient. Something more was required: proof of character, of effort, of obedience to the city's moral expectations. Without that proof, suffering was reclassified as instruction rather than emergency. Churches reinforced this framework gently but persistently. Sermons reminded congregations that charity must be wise, that help given without discernment risked encouraging vice. Poverty was discussed as a condition with causes rooted in personal failure, laziness, intemperance, poor judgment. To relieve it indiscriminately was framed as dangerous kindness, mercy, misplaced. Better to help the right poor than all of them. This language filtered outward quickly. It appeared in pamphlets, conversations, and charitable guidelines. Committees formed to assess applicants, to separate the deserving from the rest. Widows with young children fared better than unmarried mothers. The elderly earned sympathy if they had worked long years. The disabled were pitied if their impairment was visible and beyond dispute. Everyone else faced suspicion. Applicants learned the rules quickly. They rehearsed their stories, emphasizing acceptable details and omitting anything that might suggest moral ambiguity. Pride was swallowed. Shame was managed carefully. To receive help, one had to present suffering in the correct shape. Hunger became narrative. Illness became credential. Virtue became currency. Inspectors visited homes during the season, noting cleanliness, order, and demeanor. A tidy room suggested discipline. Quiet children suggested good parenting. Any sign of disorder could jeopardize aid, regardless of cause. The irony was sharp. Maintaining the appearance of control required energy and resources often unavailable to those most in need. Still, the expectation remained. Christmas intensified this scrutiny. The season demanded generosity, but only of a particular kind: visible, controlled, and morally affirming. Donors wanted reassurance that their kindness was not wasted. The idea that poverty might stem from forces beyond individual control threatened this reassurance. Deservingness restored it, offering a framework in which giving could feel righteous rather than destabilizing. The undeserving poor became a convenient category. They explained away visible suffering without requiring systemic change. If hunger persisted, it was because the hungry had failed to qualify. The city's conscience remained intact. The winter's cruelty was reframed as consequence. Children absorbed this sermon early. They learned that need did not guarantee care. They watched adults negotiate worth, heard whispers about families who had brought it on themselves. These lessons shaped how they understood both help and harm. Compassion became conditional. Survival became performative. Even those who received aid felt its weight. Gratitude was expected not once, but continuously. Any misstep risked re-evaluation. Assistance could be withdrawn as quickly as it was granted. The relationship was not one of support, but supervision. Charity did not free recipients from judgment. It placed them under it. Those who refused to apply out of pride, fear, or distrust were quietly erased from consideration. Their suffering did not count because it was not recorded. The system did not see them and therefore did not owe them anything. Silence again served as both shield and sentence. By the end of the season, accounts were closed. Committees congratulated themselves on prudent giving. Churches praised generosity exercised with wisdom. Donors felt satisfied. The poor returned to endurance, having learned once more where they stood. In Victorian London, the sermon of deservingness echoed long after the bells fell silent. It shaped who was helped, who was blamed, and who was ignored. Winter did not soften hearts so much as sharpen criteria. And beneath the language of goodwill, the city quietly reaffirmed a truth it rarely questioned, that suffering was acceptable so long as it appeared earned. In the harshest quarters of Victorian London, relief arrived not in abundance but in queues. Soup lines formed outside parish halls and charitable kitchens, their order both practical and performative. The city measured its poor through these lines, recording attendance as though each presence confirmed character. Hunger became observable, and observation became judgment. The process was slow, deliberate, and exacting. Each applicant waited in the chill, hands tucked into sleeves, breath misting in the air. Children fidgeted at their parents' feet, shifting from one cold foot to the other, learning patience as necessity. The line itself was a test, a display of endurance before any nourishment was offered. Those who could not wait quietly were noticed, their impatience marked as evidence of moral deficiency. Volunteers and overseers managed the proceedings with meticulous attention. They counted portions, tracked arrivals, and observed behavior. Gratitude was not optional. Words of thanks, heads bowed, eyes lowered, were expected. A single misstep, complaint, hesitation, or perceived entitlement risked exclusion. The act of receiving was not free, it was conditional, a performance under the city's eyes. The food itself was modest. Broth thin with vegetables, bread often stale, a small ration meant to last precisely until the next distribution. It offered warmth more than fullness, sustenance more than comfort. The taste was functional, the presentation careful to avoid the appearance of charity as indulgence. Each ladle poured reinforced the hierarchy: giver, observer, and recipient. Boundaries were enforced with quiet authority. Children absorbed the lessons early. They learned to follow instructions precisely, to stand still, to accept what was given without question. Observation trained them in compliance. Even in hunger, they understood that behavior mattered as much as need. The soup line became a microcosm of the city itself, structured, scrutinized, and unequal. Families internalized these routines. Mothers coached children in whispered instructions, teaching gestures and words that would signal obedience. Fathers, if present, offered silent guidance, reinforcing the importance of patience and deference. Every step, every glance, every response was part of an invisible ledger the city maintained. Compliance became survival. The presence of outsiders intensified scrutiny. Well-meaning visitors occasionally attended distributions, observing the process or offering donations. Their gaze added pressure, making the performance of humility even more exacting. Applicants adjusted automatically, hiding frustration, masking hunger, and tempering emotion. The need to appear deserving became as pressing as the need for food itself. Cold air pressed through open doors and broken windows, the dampness of winter infiltrating every corner. Volunteers moved quickly, aware that exposure could harm both themselves and recipients. The process emphasized efficiency, but also discipline. Every step of the routine taught the city's lessons: patience, gratitude, and the moral hierarchy of need. For the city's observers, the line confirmed the efficacy of the system. Aid was distributed, need was visible, virtue was demonstrated. For those in the line, the experience was a complex negotiation between survival and dignity. Food arrived, yes, but so did evaluation, moral accounting, and the reminder of who held power. By evening, the line dispersed. Empty bowls were returned. Children returned home with parents, carrying the quiet weight of hunger still present in their bellies. The city, meanwhile, recorded another day of winter, noting which streets had been attended to, which faces observed, and which need deferred. In Victorian London, the soup line was neither charity nor convenience alone. It was a tool, a spectacle, and a lesson. It measured endurance, taught compliance, and reinforced social order. Winter, as always, remained indifferent, while hunger and observation intertwined to mark the season unmistakably. Even as the city feigned warmth, a more formal inspection often arrived unannounced. The officers of the poor law. December was their season, when need was visible and morality was measured. These visits were brief, meticulous, and profoundly intrusive, entering homes with authority and leaving behind quiet judgment. Christmas, for many, arrived alongside scrutiny rather than celebration. The poor law officers did not knock with cheer. They arrived with purpose, ledger and pen in hand, stepping across thresholds into rooms thick with smoke and damp. Every item was noted: the alignment of furniture, the wear of blankets, the state of cooking implements. A hearth unlit, a wall cracked, a child coughing, each became a mark, each recorded for later evaluation. The city's moral and physical order was being checked, and every resident of the household was under review. Mothers greeted them cautiously, aware that tone, posture, and words all contributed to the perception of deservingness. A nervous glance, an evasive answer, even a sigh might be noted. Children, already trained in quiet endurance, were silent or obedient, understanding that their behavior affected more than their own comfort. Fathers, if present, stood still, concealing exhaustion and concern beneath a veneer of composure. Every action was performed with precision, as though the survival of the family depended upon it, because it often did. The officers inquired into provisions, noting what was stored in cupboards and jars. They asked about coal, food, and clothing. They questioned routines, attendance at work or school, and the presence of illness. The answers were expected to align with established norms. Too much hesitation, too much explanation, or too visible distress might suggest weakness or improvidence. Too little, and the household risked appearing indifferent or morally suspect. This inspection was as much about education as enforcement. Families were reminded, gently or sternly, of what they must do to maintain eligibility for aid. They were taught to ration more carefully, clean more thoroughly, and arrange their lives in accordance with the city's expectations. The poor law officers embodied both the promise and the threat of assistance. Relief could be granted, but it came tethered to continued compliance. Christmas heightened the tension. Homes, already strained by scarcity, prepared for the day, but the looming visit reminded families that scarcity alone was insufficient justification for assistance. Children might receive small gifts, meals might be stretched carefully, and coal saved, yet all remained provisional until observed and approved. The holiday, ostensibly a time for generosity, became a backdrop for evaluation, a season of moral accounting in its own right. Silence dominated the visit. Conversations were measured, questions answered without elaboration. Mothers explained sparingly, fathers nodded carefully, children waited. The officers moved through rooms with quiet authority, scanning, noting, comparing. Their departure left the household changed, though not materially. The family had been weighed, its standing recorded, its behavior corrected. Relief, if it came, would follow with conditions, its generosity limited by observation. Even the act of receiving assistance carried a lingering echo. Families internalized the evaluation, speaking less, arranging more, and teaching children the unspoken rules of the city. They understood that survival required compliance, and that Christmas offered no exception. The season's ritual warmth existed largely for those already observed and approved. By evening, the visit was a memory, but it left a mark deeper than any coal fire. The city had affirmed its hierarchy. Those who lived at the margins had been reminded of the fine line between deserving and undeserving. Assistance was contingent, morality visible, and judgment subtle but unyielding. In Victorian London, the Christmas visit from the poor law was less about celebration and more about control. It was a lesson in order, a performance of authority, and a quiet reinforcement of winter's persistent hierarchy. The day passed, the season continued, and the households remained measured and marked under the city's unblinking eye. Even when Christmas arrived, the city's most vulnerable often found no pause. Workhouses, those institutions designed for containment rather than comfort, adopted the season with all the ceremony of duty and none of the warmth of tradition. Decorations, when they appeared, were sparse and functional, arranged to suggest participation rather than celebration. Candles flickered in corners more for inspection than for cheer. The workhouse itself, stone, iron, and draught, remained unchanged, cold, dim, and exacting. Residents were aware of the day's dual nature. Christmas meant something special must occur, but it also meant scrutiny. Rules were not suspended for the season. Labour continued according to schedules devised long before the first snow. Men, women, and children moved in measured steps through chores that mattered more to record-keepers than to inhabitants. Even tasks ordinarily trivial, sweeping, scrubbing, mending, acquired ritual significance, as though careful work might momentarily absolve the deprivations surrounding them. Food, the most visible sign of festivity, arrived in portioned, controlled servings. A broth, thin but heated, was distributed quietly. Bread, occasionally enriched with a scrap of sugar or fat, was doled with precision. For the children, it might seem like abundance. For adults, it underscored the scarcity that framed every other day. The workhouse's generosity never exceeded necessity. It instructed as much as it fed, impressing upon residents the lesson of moderation and obedience. Behavior was observed closely. Staff noted manners at table, attentiveness during any small entertainment provided, and compliance in movement between rooms. Christmas was conditional. Enjoyment had to be performed correctly. A child laughing too loudly or lingering too long over food might be corrected. Adults were expected to model restraint. The holiday's appearance depended on order. Relief was granted sparingly, and any breach of propriety could risk reduction of privilege or punishment. Discipline carried into other areas. Beds were arranged according to precise regulations, separated by walls or partitions that offered little comfort. Warmth was measured and rationed. Blankets were folded meticulously, whether or not they sufficed for the night. The air remained damp, smelling faintly of soap, sweat, and exhaustion. Even the smallest act of comfort required permission, or at least compliance with the workhouse's invisible code. Entertainment, when permitted, was brief and functional. Singing, if allowed, was performed in rows. Voices modulated for volume and tone. Stories were read aloud, chosen for moral content rather than amusement. Laughter was limited, applause controlled. These activities were less for pleasure than for demonstration, proof that residents could perform joy appropriately, even while enduring deprivation. The performance itself became a part of survival. Children, accustomed to silence and scarcity, learned early to navigate these expectations. They watched carefully, mimicking correct behavior to avoid reprimand. Adults guided them subtly, teaching gestures, expressions, and responses that would signal compliance. The workhouse trained its charges not only in labor, but in the performative aspects of existence. Christmas was no exception. Visitors occasionally arrived, inspecting the day, delivering small gifts or tokens of charity. Their presence reinforced the dual function of festivity. Aid was accompanied by observation. Approval mattered more than abundance. Residents understood that generosity existed only within the constraints imposed by others. By evening, the workhouse returned to its ordinary rhythm. Candles were extinguished, meals concluded, beds prepared. The day left its mark, not in warmth or celebration, but in the quiet knowledge that even festive moments were conditional. Christmas offered no escape, only structure and exercise in endurance framed by the city's expectations. In Victorian London, the workhouse wore Christmas like a costume, a thin disguise over unyielding walls. The season arrived, observed, and departed, leaving the cold, the labor, and the lesson intact. Residents survived not for joy, but for compliance, and the year moved forward, measured in discipline rather than delight. In Victorian London, the season of supposed togetherness often meant the opposite: separation. Families, already stretched thin by poverty, labor, and the unyielding cold, found themselves divided as children were sent away to institutions, relatives, or temporary care under charity programs. Christmas, far from a time of reunion, became a reminder of absence and loss, a season measured in who was present and who was not. The Poor Law and charitable organizations orchestrated much of this separation. Workhouses admitted children from families deemed unable to provide adequately for them, ostensibly for their welfare, but also to maintain social order. Attendance at schools or orphanages often increased during the winter months, both to provide education and to relieve overcrowded homes. These movements were framed as temporary, necessary, and beneficial, but for the children involved, the reality was stark. Children awoke on Christmas morning to find parents absent or replaced by strangers. Doors that normally opened to familiar voices revealed caretakers whose hands were kind, but whose presence carried the weight of authority. Rooms were unfamiliar, beds shared with others, and warmth limited. The city's generosity had arrived in measured doses, and it came at the price of familial comfort. The holiday was performed on borrowed time and borrowed trust. Letters and small gifts were often the only link to home. A piece of clothing, a token of confectionery, or a card might accompany a child, carried carefully by overseers or volunteers. These items were treasured, but they were fragile substitutes. They could not replicate the physical closeness of family, the smell of home, the sound of voices raised in laughter or reprimand. For many children, these substitutes became the memory of Christmas itself. The psychological cost was profound. Separation reinforced vulnerability and obedience. Children learned to regulate their desires, to suppress cries of disappointment, to perform gratitude, even when absence gnawed at them. Those sent away quickly understood the implicit rules. Compliance was rewarded with food, warmth, and occasional acknowledgement. Resistance risked further punishment or neglect. Joy became performative, calibrated to institutional expectations rather than personal feeling. Parents, too, endured hardship. Mothers and fathers confronted the tension between care and compliance. Sending a child away could mean temporary safety, nutrition, or shelter, but it also inflicted emotional strain. Their presence was measured in distance, their affection constrained by circumstance. Guilt was a constant companion, silently shared among neighbors who faced the same choices. The city's moral framework offered little comfort. Necessity overrode sentiment. In wealthier households, separation took subtler forms. Children might be sent to boarding schools, placed with relatives, or kept occupied by tutors and servants. The principle was the same. Christmas required structure, and structure sometimes demanded that affection be mediated through distance. Even in privilege, warmth was conditional, contingent on performance and propriety. For those confined in institutions, the holiday was regimented. Meals were scheduled and rationed, exercises and prayers conducted with precision, and small celebrations carefully orchestrated to avoid disorder. Laughter, if it appeared, was tempered by the awareness of supervision. Gifts were distributed with careful documentation, and excess enthusiasm was noted rather than encouraged. Christmas became a lesson in restraint as much as a moment of joy. By evening, the separations were entrenched. Children returned to beds that were not their own, families absorbed into distant memory, and the city continued its rhythm. Silence, already a currency in homes, deepened into solitude. The lesson was absorbed. Christmas could be observed, endured, and performed, but it was rarely free. and it was rarely complete. In Victorian London, the separation of children for the season revealed the city's true priorities. Survival, order, and appearance took precedence over familial intimacy. Christmas, though celebrated in print and ritual, existed most vividly in its absences measured in distance, quiet, and the subdued longing of those forced to endure it apart. In Victorian London, charity often performed more than it provided. The giving of aid was not only a relief for the needy, it was a demonstration, a public theatre in which social hierarchies were rehearsed and reinforced. Christmas illuminated this dynamic more vividly than any other time, as streets and halls became stages for acts of generosity, carefully arranged, carefully observed. Charitable events were meticulously organized. Notices appeared in newspapers, inviting the well-to-do to attend, contribute, and witness. Halls were cleaned, tables arranged, and portions carefully measured. The food, clothing, and small gifts distributed were real, yet their distribution was choreographed to maximize visibility. Generosity became performative, a public affirmation of virtue rather than a private act of compassion. Donors arrived in carriages, cloaks drawn tightly against the December air, ready to be seen. They handed coins, parcels, and plates with deliberate ceremony, ensuring that attendants, witnesses, and recipients alike could note their involvement. A well-timed smile, a polite word, a visible gesture of attention, all were components of the performance. Generosity was valuable only insofar as it could be observed, acknowledged, and recorded. Recipients, for their part, understood the implicit rules. Gratitude was expected to be audible, measured, and continuous. A slight hesitation, a faltering word, a gesture too small or too large, could mark a family as unworthy. The moral currency of charity depended upon the demonstration of compliance, humility, and recognition. To receive without performing gratitude was to risk exclusion, or worse, rebuke. Children learned the theatre quickly. Their behavior became part of the spectacle. They were guided to behave politely, speak softly, and accept gifts with appropriate decorum. Their faces, expressions, and posture mattered as much as the food or clothing they received. A child's excitement, if mismanaged, could disrupt the intended narrative of orderly giving and proper gratitude. Observation became as necessary as nourishment. Clergy and volunteers acted as both directors and monitors. They reinforced the performance by distributing aid according to schedule, monitoring interactions, and correcting deviations from prescribed behavior. The spectacle maintained social order, demonstrating to donors that their contributions produced not only relief, but instruction. It reassured the city that the poor were being guided, disciplined, and integrated into the moral framework. Even the media participated. Newspapers printed accounts of charitable events, highlighting the generosity of donors, the decorum of recipients, and the orderly conduct of the proceedings. Illustrations showed children lined neatly, meals served with symmetry, and adults observing attentively. These images reinforced the idea that Christmas in London was both abundant and moral, regardless of what happened behind unobserved doors. Yet beneath the performance, reality remained harsh. Food was scarce, warmth limited, and cold persisted. The spectacle did not address the structural deficiencies that necessitated it. Charity acted as a lens through which inequality could be observed and managed, rather than eliminated. Winter endured, and hunger persisted, quietly, between acts. Families internalized the performance, adjusting behavior not only for the day of distribution but for future observation. Compliance became habitual, gratitude rehearsed. Even outside formal events, the lessons of the spectacle carried into homes, informing daily conduct, reinforcing hierarchy, and training children in the city's invisible rules. In Victorian London, charity at Christmas was both a blessing and a display. It fed, yes, but it also instructed and demonstrated, framing need as moral narrative and generosity as virtue in plain view. The season's warmth might flicker briefly, but the performance endured, a reminder that in the city, every act, even kindness, was measured, monitored, and made to serve the theatre of social order. In the midst of Christmas, relief arrived, often cloaked in the language of faith. Religious institutions, eager to maintain authority and influence, offered aid with stipulations carefully bound to doctrine and observation. Meals, clothing, and tokens of care were distributed under watchful eyes, accompanied by sermons and counsel that reminded recipients of the moral currency they now carried. In Victorian London, assistance was never free. It was weighed in virtue as much as measured in ounces. Church halls glimmered faintly in the winter gloom, decorated modestly yet deliberately, as if to frame relief within the proper context. Candles flickered along walls, their light softening stone and brick, but never erasing the draught that pressed inward. Each act of charity was accompanied by instruction, whispered reminders of obedience, repeated cues to humility, and the subtle insistence that gratitude must be visible. Aid was conditional. The city's generosity came tethered to expectation. Recipients were acutely aware of this debt. A bowl of broth, thin but hot, was as much a moral lesson as nourishment. Children were taught to accept, with folded hands and lowered eyes, to murmur thanks in tones that would satisfy both conscience and overseer. Parents coached them quietly, instructing on posture, phrasing, and demeanor. The performance of receiving became as essential as the sustenance itself. Hunger could be fed, but only if accompanied by proper acknowledgement. Adults bore a similar burden. Pride was negotiated carefully, tempered to avoid offending those delivering aid. Women ensured homes appeared orderly, that children were presentable, that explanations of scarcity were carefully phrased. Men adjusted speech and gesture to project control and compliance. The morality of the household, not just its need, was under evaluation. One misstep, a sigh, a complaint, an inattention to prescribed gratitude could influence future assistance. The sermons delivered alongside aid reinforced this lesson. They framed hardship as instructive, suffering as a temporary test, and relief as a reward for compliance. The language emphasized duty over comfort, submission over entitlement. Charity became a tool for shaping behavior, aligning the poor with the city's moral framework, while ostensibly addressing material need. It ensured that the season reinforced hierarchy as much as it offered kindness. Children internalized these dynamics quickly. They learned that generosity was not only something received, but something performed. To ask too boldly, to accept too eagerly, or to appear ungrateful risked censure. They absorbed the lesson that poverty came with obligation, that relief was inseparable from moral instruction. The season taught both dependence and discipline, a dual education in need and propriety. The debt of gratitude extended beyond individual actions. Families felt an enduring obligation, an invisible tether connecting them to institutions and donors long after meals were consumed and gifts distributed. They calculated behavior daily, adjusting to preserve favor. Even minor deviations, children arguing, adults showing exasperation, were weighed carefully against the moral ledger the city maintained. Survival was inseparable from compliance. Meanwhile, the city reinforced its authority through observation. Clergy and volunteers monitored behavior, recording adherence to norms as carefully as attendance or need. Reports of households were noted and filed. Assistance in December became both a blessing and an assessment, teaching order, humility, and hierarchy in a single session. The poor law and charitable organizations measured virtue alongside hunger, ensuring that aid strengthened obedience as well as appetite. By evening, families returned to their homes, the moral ledger balanced for the day. Relief had been granted, lessons reinforced, and hierarchy confirmed. The warmth offered by religious charity was fleeting, its value measured as much in comportment as in calories. In Victorian London, Christmas arrived not only with gifts and meals, but with expectation, instruction, and debt, a reminder that generosity carried conditions and that survival was inseparable from moral performance. In Victorian London, the offer of aid was rarely simple. Benevolence came wrapped in expectation, observed by authority, measured in virtue, as much as in pounds and ounces. To accept charity was to acknowledge deficiency, to bow beneath scrutiny, to commit oneself to a performance of gratitude. For some families, the act was intolerable. Pride, quiet, stubborn, and fiercely protective, became a barrier, a choice that could define a household's Christmas as sharply as hunger itself. Refusal often began before the knock on the door. Families anticipated inspection with dread, imagining questions that could not be answered, judgments that would arrive even without spoken words. Mothers calculated gestures, fathers considered posture, and children learned to hold themselves still. Silence became both shield and statement. To speak too freely could invite evaluation. To accept freely could compromise autonomy. Pride demanded restraint. When officers or volunteers arrived bearing relief, the tension crystallized. Bowls of broth, slices of bread, scraps of clothing, they were tangible tokens of care, but also of dependence. To reach for them without caution was to acknowledge inadequacy. Families declined delicately, citing previous provision, existing resources, or plans already in place. Words were carefully chosen, expressions neutral, gestures minimized. Refusal was rehearsed, deliberate, a declaration that the household could endure without interference. Children watched these exchanges closely. They learned that need could be subordinated to principle. They observed the quiet strength of refusal, absorbing lessons in self-discipline that complemented the more visible lessons of endurance. Hunger remained, but it became framed as tolerable, even honorable, when accompanied by composure. The emotional calculus of winter was complex. Survival weighed against dignity, and dignity often held greater value. The practical cost of pride was immediate. Food might be scarce, fire minimal, and clothing insufficient, yet families persisted. Rooms remained cold, bowls remained thin. The absence of aid compounded existing hardship, but the act of refusal preserved autonomy. The household performed resilience publicly and privately, asserting that it could manage without charity. Even as winter pressed relentlessly against walls and bodies, refusal was also social. Neighbors observed behavior and inferred character. A household that declined help could signal stability, self-reliance, or moral rectitude. It could claim, in the language of the city, a measured strength that transcended circumstance. Conversely, it could provoke judgment for unnecessary pride. The balance was delicate, and families navigated it with the care of tightrope walkers. Yet the strain of refusal was cumulative. Mothers calculated each movement to minimize waste and discomfort. Fathers absorbed extra work to compensate for absence of relief. Children learned to suppress complaints, to ration attention and energy. The cost was physical and emotional, but it carried symbolic weight. Pride became a currency, as real as the coal, the bread, or the warmth withheld by winter. Even the city accommodated this choice, though grudgingly. Officers noted the absence of compliance, chalked it in their ledgers, and moved on. Charity, observed or otherwise, was always conditional. Those who refused were neither praised nor punished formally. Their endurance simply became another data point in the ongoing assessment of the city's poor. Survival required strategy as much as fortitude. By evening, the household gathered, sharing what little warmth and nourishment they possessed. Silence dominated, layered with pride fear, and careful calculation. Christmas passed without public acknowledgement, yet internally it carried a quiet triumph. Refusal had preserved autonomy, maintained dignity, and asserted control in a city that measured lives by need, compliance, and observation. In Victorian London, to decline help was as deliberate an act as any labour, and it shaped the season in ways no gift could. Poverty in Victorian London carried consequences that were rarely articulated aloud. It did not announce itself with ceremony or proclamation. It arrived silently, threading itself through every aspect of daily life, and imposed penalties that were felt more than named. In December, when the city claimed to celebrate generosity, the poor discovered that absence itself was punishment. The quiet, relentless marking of difference between those who possessed and those who did not. Children felt it first. The lack of warmth, nourishment, and suitable clothing was always present, but during winter it became acute. Fingers reddened, toes stiffened, and breath emerged in small clouds from chapped lips. They learned to move carefully, to conserve energy, to accept hunger as constant companion. The cold was not merely physical, it was a social language, signaling who belonged and who did not. Homes bore similar markers. Walls remained damp, fires minimal, floors drafty. Furnishings were sparse, often scavenged or improvised. Light was scarce. Every object spoke quietly of lack. A worn blanket folded repeatedly, a single cup divided among many mouths, coal rationed to a flicker of flame. In these spaces, the absence of abundance was both survival and statement. To be poor was to perform restraint and endurance at all times, an unspoken penance demanded by circumstance. Work itself punished the impoverished. Labour did not pause for winter, nor for Christmas, nor for illness. Hours lengthened to compensate for the deficiencies of diet, shelter, or clothing. Bodies weakened by scarcity were expected to sustain productivity. Weakness was judged as moral failing, even when it was purely the consequence of circumstance. The city recorded effort rather than need, and failure in performance was interpreted as evidence of character, not environment. The poor law and charitable institutions amplified these punishments subtly. Aid was conditional, distributed according to perceived worthiness, and often accompanied by observation and instruction. Hunger, illness, and cold were scrutinized for signs of moral deficiency. Households were assessed for neatness, children for behavior, and adults for compliance. Any failure to appear deserving risked restriction of assistance, withdrawal of warmth, or public reproach. The punishment was invisible but effective. Pride offered no escape. Those who refused charity out of dignity still suffered materially, and their suffering was compounded by the knowledge that they were considered morally upright by necessity rather than comfort. Compliance with aid mitigated physical hardship, but reinforced social hierarchy. Both paths imposed cost, either scarcity without acknowledgement or gratitude enforced alongside observation. Children internalized these lessons early. They learned that poverty carried expectations, that every action might be recorded, judged, and measured. Hunger was not simply a bodily sensation, it was a moral and social signal. Silence became a strategy, endurance a virtue, and obedience a currency. The season of Christmas, with its rhetoric of joy, did little to mitigate this lesson. It sharpened it. Even death bore the imprint of unspoken punishment. Those weakened by poverty succumbed more readily to winter illness. Their absences were noted in newspapers with minimal commentary, recorded as routine rather than tragedy. The city's accounting acknowledged survival and compliance, not inequity or deprivation. In Victorian London, poverty was never neutral. It was both condition and verdict, experience and expectation, visible and invisible. The unspoken punishment shaped bodies, behaviors, and households alike, reinforcing the boundaries between those who possessed and those who did not. Winter deepened the lesson, and Christmas illuminated it in shadow and absence, a reminder that survival itself was never free. In the cold streets and drafty rooms of Victorian London, Christmas arrived not only as a calendar date, but as an examination. The city, steeped in hierarchy and discipline, measured its citizens quietly, framing the season as a test of obedience. Compliance became currency. Patience and decorum were rewarded, while failure, whether in behavior, gratitude, or endurance, invited subtle reprimand. Christmas was less a respite than an assessment. The test began in homes, where parents enforced routines that prioritized performance over comfort. Children were reminded to speak only when spoken to observe meals without complaint, to accept rationed portions with appropriate gratitude. The warmth of hearth or firelight was secondary. The display of proper conduct mattered more. Every gesture was observed, implicitly if not explicitly, as a measure of character. Mothers bore the greatest weight of enforcement. They monitored posture, expression, and tone, guiding children in the unspoken rules of the household. A glance, a touch, a gentle correction all became part of the pedagogy of obedience. Mothers themselves practiced restraint, swallowing their own fatigue, hunger, or frustration to model comportment. Their labor, invisible but constant, ensured the household's performance met the city's silent standards. Fathers contributed in quieter ways. Their presence projected authority and stability. Their compliance with work schedules, their management of resources, and their muted responses to hardship reinforced the lesson that endurance was expected. Authority itself became a template for children. Adherence to structure was virtuous, deviation risky. The household became a miniature theatre, rehearsing for an audience whose approval was assumed, but whose scrutiny remained real. Charitable relief and public displays of generosity amplified this test. Those receiving aid were expected to show gratitude in form and tone. Voices were lowered, movements measured, gestures restrained. The ability to perform gratitude convincingly could determine access to meals, warmth, or small gifts. Compliance was not merely polite, it was survival. The poor internalized this quickly, learning the boundaries of acceptable behavior and the consequences of stepping beyond them. Institutions formalized the lesson. Workhouses, poor law inspections, and charitable kitchens documented conduct alongside need. Rules were enforced meticulously. Children lined up quietly. Adults responded promptly. Families displayed order at all times. Observers recorded both adherence and infraction, reinforcing the notion that Christmas was an arena in which obedience mattered as much as physical sustenance. The season's generosity was never unconditional. It was calibrated to performance. Even leisure was mediated by expectation. Singing, storytelling, and small celebrations were supervised, corrected, and timed. Excess enthusiasm could be frowned upon, misaligned behavior noted. Joy itself became conditional, measured against the city's invisible code. To participate fully required mastery of these norms, learned through experience and observation over years. The consequence of failure was subtle yet enduring. A household that faltered could lose access to aid or suffer diminished respect from neighbors and officials. Children who misbehaved internalized lessons in suppression, learning to moderate desire and expectation. Obedience became habituated, entwined with identity and survival. By evening, the assessment concluded. Meals consumed, candles extinguished, doors closed, and families returned to routine. Compliance had been demonstrated, endurance reaffirmed. The city's lesson lingered in the hush of cold rooms and the exhausted bodies of those who had performed it faithfully. In Victorian London, Christmas was never merely celebration. It was a test of patience, of propriety, of adherence to the invisible rules that governed survival. Those who passed were granted the season's fleeting warmth. Those who faltered were marked, quietly but unmistakably. The holiday's glow illuminated not only hearths, but boundaries, and the lesson endured long after the candles burned low. In Victorian London, the city's harsh winter was softened not by fire, food, or charity, but by ink. Charles Dickens, with his keen eye for detail and understanding of human endurance, began to craft a Christmas that was at once comforting, moralizing, and profoundly aspirational. His stories reached into homes where hunger, cold, and fatigue persisted, offering visions of warmth that existed more in imagination than in reality. Dickens understood the power of narrative. He presented hardship clearly, without romanticization, yet he always paired it with redemption, generosity, or moral reckoning. A child's suffering could be observed, and the reader could feel it, but it was never left unresolved. Characters were rewarded for virtue, punished for vice, and, crucially, hope was always a possibility. Through these tales, Londoners glimpsed a world in which winter could be endured, and perhaps even celebrated, when guided by propriety and conscience. The appeal of these stories was practical as much as emotional. For middle and upper-class readers, Dickens offered reassurance that the social order was meaningful and moral. Wealth, responsibility, and adherence to virtue were intertwined. Those who gave generously were affirmed. Those who labored honestly, even in obscurity, were noticed, if only within the pages of fiction. For those living on the margins, the effect was different but equally potent. Stories became instruction manuals, demonstrating how to navigate scarcity with dignity and hope. Illustrations in Dickens' works reinforced the lessons visually. Line engravings depicted families clustered around tables, children clothed in neat garments, the poor aided with dignity and gratitude. Scenes of bustling streets, crowded workhouses, and cold alleyways were counterbalanced by moments of warmth and resolution. Readers could trace the geography of hardship while imagining the ideal of relief, a Christmas experienced fully only in imagination, but felt intimately in empathy. The moral clarity offered by these stories was as important as the imagery. Characters were accountable for their choices. Tiny acts of kindness, like providing a meal or offering comfort, could transform outcomes. Neglect, cruelty, or greed were punished in ways the city could recognize without challenging the structures that produced inequality. Dickens's narratives reframed hardship as instructive, suffering as meaningful, and relief as both reward and moral duty. These tales circulated widely, reaching audiences across the city and across classes. Newspapers, periodicals, and bound editions brought the stories to households that had little else for entertainment or instruction during December. Children memorized passages. Adults read aloud by candlelight, shaping the rhythms of the season. For a brief moment, the cold streets, the drafty rooms, and the rationed fires receded into the background, replaced by vivid scenes that promised hope without altering material conditions. Yet Dickens did not obscure reality entirely. He chronicled the smells of winter streets, the hunger of children, the exhaustion of laborers. His vision was softened, certainly, but it remained grounded in truth. Readers were reminded that comfort could exist alongside discomfort, that morality and hardship were intertwined, and that the city's suffering was visible, if not yet fully addressed. It was a reality reframed for contemplation, instruction, and reflection. In this way, Dickens softened the edges of winter in the imagination. He offered guidance for endurance, moral lessons disguised as stories, and visions of warmth that could be shared in rooms too cold to be comfortable. For the city, his work became part of the season itself, a literary hearth, where hope burned more steadily than coal, and where Christmas could exist, at least in part, beyond scarcity. Here, the harshness of reality met the constructed promise of imagination, and Londoners learned to measure winter both in frost and in ink, carrying the lessons forward through another season of endurance and observation. By the later decades of Victorian London, Christmas had been thoroughly rewritten in the public imagination. Newspapers, magazines, and printed guides recounted a season of warmth, abundance, and familial harmony that existed mostly in illustration and prose. The realities of frostbitten streets, thin meals, and crowded rooms were omitted, replaced by images carefully constructed to comfort, instruct, and reassure the city's more fortunate classes. The retelling began with narrative tone. Journalists and authors described celebrations in grand homes, their warmth exaggerated, their abundance unquestioned. Children laughed at tables laden with roasted meats, plum puddings, and steaming bowls of vegetables, foods that most readers would never see outside of market stalls or charitable distributions. Adults were attentive, benevolent, and morally upright, modeling the virtues that the city wished to instill. The scene conveyed order, propriety, and a moral equilibrium that reality rarely offered. Illustrations amplified the narrative. Engravings depicted interiors neat and bright, walls decorated with holly, candles casting soft light, fireplaces roaring with coal and logs. Every detail was arranged to suggest not merely comfort but moral correctness. The poor, when represented, appeared grateful, obedient, and redeemed by the generosity of others. Scenes of disorder, illness, or scarcity were absent, leaving an idealized version of London that required imagination to reconcile with lived experience. These depictions served multiple purposes. For middle and upper-class readers, they reinforced social norms, demonstrating how a household should behave, what propriety demanded, and how virtue could be displayed materially. For the working poor and those dependent on charity, they offered instruction, gestures to imitate, manners to adopt, and gratitude to perform. The stories and images created templates for behavior, showing both the rewards of compliance and the expectations of observers. The effect of repetition was powerful. Year after year, these depictions were circulated, reprinted, and referenced. Readers internalized them as tradition, assuming the comfort and cheer described to be the norm rather than aspiration. Even when lived experience contradicted the portrayal, the images persisted, shaping memory and expectation. Children growing up alongside these prints often remembered the Christmas described, rather than the Christmas endured, and absorbed lessons about hierarchy, obedience, and virtue alongside the fiction. Charitable institutions participated in the construction. Public meals, small gifts, and seasonal distributions were arranged to resemble the illustrations and stories circulating in print. Lines were formed neatly, tables set carefully, and recipients instructed in the correct gestures of appreciation. Reality, for a brief moment, was performed to match the ideal. The spectacle of generosity reinforced the moral lessons embedded in literature and media. Yet, beneath the surface, the city remained unchanged. Streets continued to be cold, rooms damp, and bellies empty. The retelling of Christmas comfort served its purpose not by altering conditions, but by softening perception. It allowed those who observed the holiday to feel satisfaction, to claim moral alignment, and to view the city as orderly and kind, even when the harsh truth persisted. In this retelling, memory and expectation intertwined. Families looked to print and story to guide preparation. Children modeled behavior they had seen in illustrations, and adults judged themselves against an ideal largely unattainable. Christmas became both a season and a measure, a way to display virtue, perform gratitude, and imagine warmth where it was scarce. The comfortable Christmas, endlessly retold, became part of the city's collective consciousness. It existed as an aspiration, a moral framework, and a promise. Even as frost pressed against windows, meals remained sparse, and the true winter endured unsoftened. In Victorian London, comfort lived most fully in representation, and the city learned to measure December not only by temperature and provision, but by the stories it told itself about what the season should be. In December, the city presented itself through images as much as through streets and hearths. Photographs, then increasingly common, captured moments of Christmas that appeared serene, orderly, and abundant. Yet these images were selective, crafted by necessity and expectation, revealing what the photographer wished to show and omitting everything inconvenient, uncomfortable, or morally ambiguous. They conveyed comfort, prosperity, and domestic virtue, while leaving invisible the frostbite, hunger, and exhaustion that truly marked the season. Homes posed for the camera were rarely typical. Families were arranged carefully, children seated neatly, mothers upright, fathers composed. Tables displayed food in surplus, though in reality only a portion existed. Candles were lit strategically, illuminating faces and furniture, but leaving shadows where drafts and damp persisted. Walls were scrubbed, curtains replaced or drawn, and floors swept meticulously. The photograph suggested abundance. It hid absence. Children learned early how to perform for such images. Their behavior, expressions, and posture were guided by adults aware that every detail would be scrutinized. The gaze toward the lens was careful, composed, conveying both humility and decorum. A smile was permitted, but only the proper kind, modest, restrained, and socially legible. Crying, exhaustion, or visible hunger was unacceptable. The lens demanded perfection, however unattainable. Photographers understood the illusion. They manipulated angles, lighting, and composition to minimize clutter, conceal scarcity, and present a narrative of prosperity. Empty chairs were hidden from view. Rough-hewn floors and walls faded into shadow. Gifts were placed as props, bread and fruit arranged to suggest more than what existed. The photograph became a document not of reality, but of aspiration, a season of warmth, harmony, and moral rectitude. These images circulated widely. Newspapers, magazines, and pamphlets printed reproductions, teaching the public both what Christmas looked like and how it ought to be experienced. Families internalized these depictions, comparing their own homes and behavior to the constructed ideal. Children absorbed lessons in appearance, compliance, and propriety before they understood the true scarcity around them. Christmas became partly a performance measured against a visual standard, not only a lived experience. The photographs also reinforced social hierarchy. Wealthier households could afford the clothing, furnishings, and staging necessary to meet the camera's demands. Poorer families, whose spaces were cramped and resources limited, rarely appeared unless carefully mediated by charity or oversight. Even then, only carefully curated aspects were shown. Absence and suffering were erased, leaving the viewer with a perception of universality that did not exist. The contrast between image and reality was sharper in winter. Frost pressed against windows, walls remained damp, and coal was rationed, yet the photographs conveyed warmth, fullness, and abundance. They reassured the city that order and virtue persisted, even in quarters where cold and hunger dominated. The camera became both witness and deceiver, offering a comforting lie while the truth endured. Children internalized the discrepancy. They learned that appearances mattered as much as reality. Politeness, posture, and propriety were rehearsed as carefully as survival strategies, creating a dual existence, the lived winter and the visible, photographed ideal. Adults did the same, arranging households and behaviors to meet imagined expectations. In Victorian London, photographs of Christmas existed as both document and deception. They told a story of comfort, morality, and abundance, omitting everything inconvenient. In their omission, they shaped perception, expectation, and memory. The city learned to read the season not only in frost and scarcity, but in the selective light and shadow captured on glass, where winter appeared softer and hardship nearly invisible. Winter left its mark quietly, but persistently, on those who endured it. In Victorian London, survival during December was an achievement measured not in public recognition, but in the private, almost invisible continuation of life. Those who endured the cold, the hunger, the illness, and the scrutiny often carried their experience silently, never speaking of the months that tested them most. Their stories remained unrecorded, their endurance unnoticed beyond the walls they inhabited. Children who survived repeated winters learned early to mask distress. The ache of cold and hunger was folded into expressionless faces and measured behavior. They spoke only when necessary, their words precise, careful, and economical. Crying was restrained, complaints suppressed. The survival instinct merged with social instruction, teaching them that silence could preserve both body and reputation. Speaking of suffering was dangerous. It invited scrutiny, judgment, or further intervention. Parents bore their own burdens, often heavier than those of the young. Mothers measured every gesture, every word, every meal, knowing that attention to detail could mean the difference between comfort and hardship, acknowledgement and censure. Fathers carried the physical labor of survival alongside the emotional weight of providing for a household that rarely received aid without moral cost. Theirs was a silent vigilance, constant and unrelenting, shaping the rhythm of the home from dawn to dusk. Even when assistance arrived through charity, religious relief, or community support, it was rarely sufficient to change circumstances entirely. Relief was conditional, rationed, and frequently administered with observation. Families learned to internalize these acts, drawing sustenance from them while understanding the expectation of compliance and gratitude attached. The true hardship remained unspoken, encoded into daily routine rather than narrated aloud. The city itself encouraged silence. Publications highlighted the charitable, the grateful, the orderly, the failures, the suffering, and the moments of quiet endurance were omitted. Survival became a private narrative, one that contrasted sharply with the public image of Christmas that circulated in print and through institutionally staged generosity. To recount hardship too openly was to reveal failure to meet the city's expectations. Discretion became a survival skill, honed as carefully as rationing coal or food. Adults internalized lessons that children observed. Stories of endurance were told sparingly, framed in neutral terms, or omitted entirely. Regret, fear, and grief were absorbed inwardly, shared only in hushed tones with family members. Silence became an ethical stance, a method of preserving dignity even when circumstances were beyond control. In many cases, those who survived a harsh December never recounted it, leaving memory to carry weight without articulation. Social interactions reinforced the unspoken code. Neighbors, aware of each other's struggles, exchanged muted acknowledgement rather than explicit conversation. Mutual recognition existed in gestures, a shared glance, a measured nod, the tacit understanding of rationed warmth and food. Language was often insufficient. Silence and observation communicated more effectively. Even the passage of time did not erase this quiet memory. Survivors remembered the cold, the hunger, and the scrutiny long after the season passed. Their endurance shaped behaviors, teaching subsequent generations subtle strategies for survival. The lessons were practical, moral, and social. Patience, compliance, restraint, and discretion were inherited alongside memory of frostbitten toes and empty bowls. In Victorian London, surviving winter was an invisible achievement. Those who endured did so without applause or acknowledgement, carrying the weight of experience in silence. Their stories were private, their endurance unrecorded, yet their survival defined the rhythm of the city, the lives of the young, and the unspoken rules of how one moved through December's relentless cold, scrutiny, and scarcity. December left more than frost on windows and coal in hearths. It left a shadow that lingered long after the candles burned low. In Victorian London, the chill of the season carried forward into memory, shaping perception, behavior, and the quiet rhythms of life. Those who survived its trials carried lessons etched not only into their bodies, but into their expectations of the world, the city, and themselves. Children internalized this shadow first. The hunger that gnawed at stomachs, the cold that bit through layers of wool, the long hours of waiting in lines or enduring silence, all of it became a framework through which they understood scarcity and endurance. They learned to measure time against necessity rather than comfort, to ration speech as carefully as food, to hold back tears until privacy allowed. December shaped their instincts, embedding a deep awareness of limitation and hierarchy. The shadow extended to adult life as well. Parents, who had guided survival through cold, hunger, and scrutiny, carried forward the lessons they had administered. They measured warmth, rationed provisions, and instructed children with the authority of experience. Even in more abundant seasons, the imprint of December's trials lingered. Habits formed in scarcity became the norm: careful budgeting, strict household order, and silent endurance. The past dictated behavior, subtly and persistently. Memory itself was shaped by the month's intensity. Winters passed, but recollection of hardship sharpened. Parents recalled the precise weight of coal on fingers, the sound of coughing through the night, the pressure of administering gratitude alongside nourishment. Children remembered empty tables, the hush of enforced silence, and the rare, fleeting warmth of charity. These recollections framed perception. Abundance was provisional, comfort temporary, and survival dependent on vigilance. The long shadow was also social. Families internalized lessons, not only for themselves but in relation to neighbors, peers, and authorities. Observation, performance, and compliance became embedded in behavior. Survival was mediated by perception. The city watched, and those who endured silently learned to be legible to observers without drawing attention to deficiency. Courtesy, modesty, and restraint were as critical to safety as clothing and coal. Even celebration carried traces of December's severity. When Christmas arrived again, the memory of prior winters informed behavior. Children approached festivities cautiously, aware of expectations. Adults moderated indulgence, maintaining order in homes where warmth and food might again be scarce. Joy was never free of calculation. It was performed within the parameters set by prior hardship and social scrutiny. Literature, newspapers, and visual culture reinforced this long shadow. Stories emphasized virtue, endurance, and gratitude. Images depicted idealized warmth, plenty, and obedience. Reality remained harsher, yet the contrast between ideal and lived experience deepened the imprint. December's challenges were not erased, they were contextualized, moralized, and internalized, shaping anticipation as well as recollection. The city itself participated in sustaining the shadow. Work schedules, urban density, and social hierarchies ensured that scarcity and scrutiny persisted. Charity and religious relief appeared seasonally, reinforcing dependence and compliance rather than alleviating systemic hardship. The memory of December's trials informed behavior year-round. Rationing continued, patience endured, and observation persisted. In Victorian London, the long shadow of December extended far beyond the calendar month. It shaped bodies, minds, and households. It informed social interaction and internalized morality. It framed expectations of comfort, scarcity, and authority. Each winter left its mark, and each memory of survival added depth to the city's collective endurance. The season's chill, hunger, and discipline became invisible yet inescapable forces, defining how life was measured, performed, and remembered long after the last candle flickered. In Victorian London, Christmas was more than a holiday. It was a symbol, carefully curated to reflect the ideals, hierarchies, and identity of the nation itself. By the middle of the 19th century, the season had evolved from a mixture of superstition, local custom, and religious observance into a public performance of national character. Every decoration, every printed story, every charitable act was absorbed into a narrative that declared what it meant to be English, moral, and proper during the coldest and harshest month of the year. The middle and upper classes embraced Christmas as an expression of civility and decorum. Hearths were arranged meticulously, tables set to suggest both abundance and restraint, and families displayed themselves as embodiments of virtue and respectability. Through these rituals, homes became microcosms of the nation, orderly, controlled, and visually reassuring. Children learned to perform manners as they learned to sing carols. Obedience, decorum, and gratitude became entwined with identity, moral, and civic alike. Printed media amplified this national ideal. Illustrated periodicals circulated images of Christmas dinners, carol singing, and gift exchanges, emphasizing domestic harmony and social propriety. Advertisements promised abundance while reinforcing hierarchy. Those with resources displayed them in staged homes. Those without were encouraged to perform compliance and humility. The message was consistent. Participating correctly in the season affirmed one's belonging, not merely to a household or neighborhood, but to the broader moral and cultural order of the nation. Charity, too, became a vehicle for national self-definition. Distributions of food, clothing, and small gifts were organized publicly, often with ceremonies emphasizing visibility, gratitude, and performance. The city's wealthier classes could demonstrate both benevolence and refinement simultaneously. Relief was framed as civic duty, and the public display of generosity became a sign that the nation was ordered, moral, and capable of harmonizing wealth and care. Yet the assistance was never fully neutral. It reinforced the boundaries between those who possessed and those who endured. Children internalized these lessons from an early age. Christmas taught them that identity was both inherited and performed. Success meant complying with social norms, participating in rituals, and displaying proper gratitude. Failure, disobedience, ungratefulness, or neglect threatened both personal reputation and familial standing. National belonging was inseparable from participation in the seasonal scripts that defined propriety, generosity, and endurance. Even for the working poor, the season framed identity through observation. Their behavior, whether in queues for charity, in crowded homes, or in workhouses, was continuously assessed against the idealized models circulating in print, in public space, and in institutional guidance. Compliance and humility became markers not only of survival, but of legitimacy. Performing the correct moral and social responses confirmed one's place within the city's, and by extension the nation's order. The long shadow of December reinforced this identity. Every hardship experienced, the cold, the hunger, the scrutiny was imbued with significance. It became a moral lesson, a performance, and a confirmation of character. The nation was not merely measured by wealth or power, but by the discipline, gratitude, and endurance its citizens demonstrated in winter. December's trials and ceremonies, simultaneously harsh and instructive, codified the seasonal rituals that carried forward national self-perception. By the season's end, Christmas had accomplished more than celebration. It had reaffirmed class boundaries, cultivated virtue, and shaped public perception. The rituals, stories, and performances embedded in the city's fabric translated personal conduct into civic meaning. Victorian cheer, in its lights, songs, and carefully measured generosity, was less a moment of simple joy than a lens through which the nation measured itself, its morality, its discipline, and its collective identity amid frost-bitten streets and draughty rooms. The season became a mirror, reflecting not only what the city was, but what it aspired to be. Victorian London, by December, had established patterns that extended beyond mere survival. Lessons were taught daily through frost-bitten streets, draughty rooms, and the relentless demands of social expectation. Yet alongside these lessons lay a quieter truth. Much was learned, carefully observed, and internalized, while far more was deliberately ignored, displaced, or left unspoken. The city, in its pursuit of order and propriety, recorded its moral education with precision, even as it neglected the deeper causes of hardship. Children absorbed knowledge before they fully understood it. Hunger taught patience, cold demanded endurance, and waiting in lines or at workhouses instilled discipline. Every small act of compliance, folded hands, lowered eyes, restrained speech, was a mark of understanding. They learned to navigate scarcity with resourcefulness, to recognize authority, and to perform gratitude even when it felt undeserved. These lessons shaped behavior not only for survival but for social inclusion, teaching the young that propriety was inseparable from acceptance. Adults, too, absorbed lessons with quiet intensity. Mothers managed households with vigilance, rationing coal, stretching food, and teaching silence as a virtue. Fathers maintained employment and projected authority, even as exhaustion pressed heavily upon them. In these acts, the city imparted its expectations. Self-reliance, restraint, and adherence to rules were paramount. Compliance became as necessary as warmth or nourishment, the unspoken curriculum of urban endurance. The city itself codified these lessons through observation, oversight, and institution. Workhouses, poor law inspections, and charitable distributions assessed conduct alongside need, reinforcing behavior the authorities deemed acceptable. Children learned that success could be measured in compliance. Adults learned that survival required public performance of virtue. Generosity was mediated, relief conditional, and obedience enforced subtly but pervasively. Yet, alongside these carefully recorded lessons lay vast omissions. The structural causes of hardship, overcrowding, inadequate housing, insufficient wages, and pervasive illness were largely ignored. Policy, charity, and literature reinforced moral explanations for poverty, emphasizing obedience, virtue, and industriousness rather than systemic reform. Winter's cruelty was framed as natural or instructive, leaving the city's deeper inequities unaddressed. The poor were trained to endure, not empowered to change their circumstances. Charitable acts often masked this neglect. A bowl of broth or a small gift provided temporary comfort, but it never addressed the broader reality. Scarcity was endemic, cold pervasive, and labor unrelenting. The performance of giving reassured donors, instructing recipients in propriety while leaving inequality intact. Moral lessons were internalized, structural ones were left unseen. Cultural narratives reinforced selective attention. Stories, newspapers, and illustrations emphasized virtue, gratitude, and familial harmony, portraying hardships as temporary tests rather than persistent conditions. These tales instructed readers to admire endurance and obedience, to value discipline, and to accept hierarchy. Yet they omitted the persistence of cold, hunger, and deprivation. The city learned to teach compliance while ignoring causality. Individuals carried this duality into memory. The lessons internalized patience, gratitude, resourcefulness, endured alongside recollections of scarcity, cold, and moral scrutiny. Survival demanded attention to both, yet the systemic forces shaping daily life were rarely named aloud. Knowledge was acquired, yes, but understanding remained incomplete, circumscribed by the city's moral priorities. By the end of December, the dual record was clear. Victorian London had taught its citizens to endure, to comply, and to perform virtue, embedding resilience and propriety as central to identity. Yet it had simultaneously ignored the deeper forces that necessitated such endurance, leaving structural inequities untouched. The city's lessons and omissions coexisted, intertwined as tightly as frost with brick, forming a complex, haunting legacy that would shape generations long after the season had passed. In December, the city tallied its losses quietly. Death, when it came, was rarely sensationalized. It arrived as routine, recorded with precision, and filed away with other seasonal statistics. Names appeared in newspapers in small type, understated obituaries, or municipal registers, acknowledgements sufficient for record but insufficient for mourning. In Victorian London, the dead were counted, measured, and then largely forgotten, their absence folded seamlessly into the rhythm of the living. Winter demanded this economy of recognition. Cold, hunger, and disease claimed bodies methodically, and each death was an event more administrative than emotional. Clerks noted the deceased, health inspectors recorded cause when known, and families performed private mourning in homes too small or too cold to allow public grief. The city observed, in ink and ledger, but offered little space for lasting acknowledgement. Life had to continue. Children learned early that death was present but often invisible. Friends and neighbors disappeared, moved away, or succumbed to illness, leaving gaps in the rhythm of school and play. They were instructed in silence, taught to manage loss without complaint, to continue routines as if absence had altered nothing. The lesson was practical as well as moral. Survival depended on focus, discipline, and compliance, even when grief pressed close. Families carried grief inward, internalizing loss in ways measured and constrained. The death of a child, a sibling, a parent, was felt deeply, but expression was limited by circumstance. Homes lacked warmth, resources, and privacy. Mourning had to be managed alongside survival. Candles were lit, prayers offered, but the broader city moved on, indifferent. The living were always a priority. Grief could be observed, but never prolonged in public. Institutions reinforced the economy of memory. Hospitals, workhouses, and poor law offices recorded deaths in registers, noting dates, ages, and sometimes causes. These entries were devoid of narrative, stripping each life of context and individuality. Death became data, a necessary part of urban administration. The human experience was secondary to the maintenance of social order and record-keeping. The season's contrasts amplified the invisibility of loss. Christmas, with its staged abundance, decorations, and stories of warmth, created a public display of vitality and joy. The living were foregrounded, performing gratitude, obedience, and celebration. Those who had died were backgrounded, absent from the narrative of comfort and cheer. The city's visual and literary culture erased them from view, reinforcing the illusion of abundance while concealing scarcity's toll. Charitable acts, too, offered no lasting redress. Meals, gifts, and assistance reached the living, while the dead were left unacknowledged. Funerals occurred quietly, often with minimal attendance, for practical reasons: frost, cost, and the sheer frequency of loss. Tombstones and burial registers preserved names only formally. Memory depended on family and intimate community, rarely extending into the public consciousness. Yet even as the dead were forgotten publicly, their absence shaped the living. Children internalized vulnerability. Adults remembered the precarity of survival. The city's invisible dead influenced behavior, teaching restraint, vigilance, and compliance. Life, constrained and observed, was both a continuation and a memorial, a living tribute to endurance under unrelenting conditions. In Victorian London, death was accounted for, meticulously and coldly. Yet after the ink dried and registers were filed, the city turned inward, prioritizing the living, the productive, and the visible. The dead became part of the season's quiet architecture, noted, recorded, and then absorbed into the shadows of winter. Their stories acknowledged only in silence, remembered privately, and otherwise erased from public attention. Even decades after the streets of Victorian London fell silent under December frost, the city's memory of Christmas remained filtered, idealized, and misleading. Modern accounts, printed, photographed, and narrated, recount the season as a time of abundance, warmth, and cheerful display. They celebrate generosity, family, and communal joy. Yet beneath these representations lies a persistent misunderstanding. The true experience of winter in the city, marked by hunger, cold, and relentless observation, is largely erased from collective memory. The distortion begins with literature. Stories, novels, and periodicals emphasized morality, decorum, and resolution, portraying hardship only as a foil for eventual comfort. Hunger, cold, and loss were smoothed over by plot, sentiment, or moral lesson. Dickens, Thackeray, and other chroniclers presented suffering as instructive rather than systemic, creating a narrative in which lessons replaced realities. Readers internalized the impression that charity, virtue, and endurance sufficed to make winter bearable. Visual culture reinforced these myths. Illustrations and early photographs depicted tables laden with food, families gathered in bright, orderly rooms, children smiling in neat garments. Drafty walls, thin blankets, rationed coal, and coughing children were edited out either literally or through omission. The images communicated abundance and warmth as normative, embedding a perception of Christmas that few experienced firsthand. Even charitable acts contributed to the distortion. Distributions of food, clothing, and small gifts were staged carefully, emphasizing order, gratitude, and civility. Recipients were expected to perform compliance, making generosity appear effective and widespread. Observers absorbed these public demonstrations, often mistaking them for comprehensive relief rather than selective intervention. The poor were taught to endure and display gratitude, while the city learned to feel moral satisfaction without confronting structural inequity. Institutional practices left deeper marks on memory. Workhouses, poor law inspections, and religious relief emphasized performance over provision. Children learned to behave correctly, adults learned to manage appearances, and families internalized compliance as a daily necessity. The enduring lesson was one of obedience and restraint, not systemic justice. Over time, these practices became invisible, their influence interpreted as cultural normality rather than conditional survival. Modern retellings compound the problem. Narratives favor nostalgia, selective moral triumph, and sanitized imagery. The human cost, the frostbitten fingers, the hollow bellies, the silent grief, the unrecorded deaths, is omitted. Survivors' endurance is celebrated abstractly, while their suffering is minimized or misunderstood. The result is a historical memory shaped less by lived experience than by cultural expectation and the city's desire to portray itself as orderly, moral, and benevolent. Children growing up on these narratives inherit a dual lesson. They learn the performative joy of Christmas, the songs, the cards, the idealized feasts, without understanding the endurance that underpinned it. They internalize a model of festivity divorced from scarcity, comfort, or labor, creating expectations for a season that never truly existed as advertised. Adults perpetuate this myth, recreating it for new generations, while forgetting the hardships that shaped their own experiences. In truth, we still get it wrong, because representation replaced reality. The Christmas of Victorian London, marked by cold, hunger, oversight, and endurance, was both instructive and punitive, shaping bodies, minds, and households. Yet the surviving cultural artifacts emphasized cheer, abundance, and virtue, concealing the labor, suffering, and moral scrutiny that defined the season for the majority. December's shadow remains. The lessons of frost, scarcity, and observation are largely unrecognized, while the city's idealized version dominates memory. To understand Christmas truly is to reckon with both the warmth that was manufactured and the cold that endured a duality. Victorian London lived and survived, yet history often forgets. The city breathed through December, not with the warmth of abundance, but with the persistence of endurance. Victorian London's Christmas, the one that actually existed, was a season measured in frost-bitten fingers, hollow bellies, and the quiet performance of virtue under pressure. Candles flickered against draughts that no fire could fully banish. Tables offered food in portions stretched beyond comfort. Families negotiated warmth, attention, and survival with care honed through years of winter. The holiday was less a celebration than a crucible. Children awoke to cold floors, thin blankets, and meals rationed to necessity. They learned the contours of scarcity with every bite, every movement, every quiet sigh of hunger that had to be contained. Their lessons were practical and moral simultaneously. Patience, endurance, and obedience were taught alongside the careful division of bread, the silent acceptance of cold, and the quiet monitoring of adults' moods. Crying, when it occurred, was moderated. Disappointment was absorbed internally. Hope was rationed alongside coal and firewood. Adults bore the weight of the season in ways both visible and invisible. Mothers coordinated meals, arranged clothing, monitored children, and enforced decorum, all while suppressing their own exhaustion and discomfort. Fathers navigated work schedules, the procurement of fuel and food, and the constant scrutiny of both the city and social observers. Every action was measured against expectation. A misplaced gesture or untidy household could jeopardize access to assistance or invite moral judgment. Survival required performance, and performance required vigilance. The city itself participated in shaping Christmas reality. Charitable distributions, religious relief, and inspections were less acts of generosity than exercises in oversight. Food was rationed, clothing doled, and coal meted with care. Every gift carried the implicit lesson that gratitude must be performed and behavior monitored. Compliance was rewarded with warmth, indulgence, or approval. Deviation risked restriction or scrutiny. Charity reinforced hierarchy even while it alleviated need, teaching that survival was inseparable from obedience. Public spaces amplified these lessons. Streets glowed with gaslight and festive display, but the light highlighted disparity rather than masked it. Shop windows and printed images promised abundance, yet for many, those images were aspirational rather than descriptive. Wealth and comfort were observed and desired, not experienced. The poor moved through shadows of these visions, performing humility, gratitude, and restraint to maintain social standing while enduring deprivation. Even death marked the season. Loss was constant yet largely invisible. Names recorded in registers or newspapers acknowledged absence, but grief was private and constrained. Families absorbed mourning quietly, balancing sorrow with survival. December's cold and scarcity amplified vulnerability, and mortality became another lesson in endurance and compliance. Despite hardship, small moments of human warmth punctuated the season. A shared bowl of broth, a token gift, or the brief proximity of family offered fleeting comfort. These moments were precious precisely because they were rare. They punctuated the pervasive lesson. The city could be endured, winter could be survived, and life, though difficult, continued under scrutiny, expectation, and moral judgment. The Christmas that actually was not a holiday of indulgence or leisure. It was a season of observation, endurance, and moral performance. It tested bodies, shaped behaviors, and delineated hierarchy. It demanded patience, obedience, and discretion, teaching lessons both explicit and implicit to children and adults alike. In Victorian London, Christmas existed in the interplay of cold, scarcity, oversight, and fleeting warmth. It was measured in survival, recorded in silence, and perpetuated in memory. The idealized images, the printed stories, and the staged generosity told a different story. The reality was quieter, harsher, and more instructive. The Christmas that actually was demanded resilience, cultivated restraint, and left its shadow long after the candles burned low.